The sun hung low over the sprawling fields of Eldamere, its golden light casting long shadows across the uneven cobblestones of the village square, where the air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread from the baker's oven and the distant, acrid tang of iron from the blacksmith's forge, a reminder of the ceaseless labor that defined life in this forgotten corner of the kingdom, where the peasants toiled from dawn till dusk under the watchful eyes of the local lords tax collectors, their backs bent with the weight of obligations that stretched back generations, an unbroken chain of servitude that none dared question, for the stories of those who had were whispered only in the darkest corners of the tavern, where men drank watered-down ale and spoke in hushed tones of rebellions crushed and hopes extinguished, their words swallowed by the ever-present fear of the Lord's soldiers, who patrolled the roads with rusted swords and hollow eyes, men who had long since traded their humanity for the meager privileges granted to those who enforced the will of the crown, a crown that had grown distant and indifferent to the suffering of its people, its attention turned instead to the wars raging along the northern borders, where entire villages had been reduced to smoldering ruins in the endless skirmishes with the barbarian tribes that poured down from the frozen wastes, their raids growing bolder with each passing season, as if they sensed the weakening grip of a kingdom rotting from within, its coffers drained by corruption, its nobility squabbling over scraps of power while the common folk starved, their bellies empty and their spirits broken, their only solace found in the fleeting moments of camaraderie around the hearth at night, where old men spun tales of a time before the taxes, before the wars, before the slow decay had set in, a time that might as well have been a myth for all the good it did them now, as the wind howled through the cracks in their crumbling homes, carrying with it the promise of another harsh winter, another season of hunger and death, another year in which survival was the only victory they could hope to achieve. And yet, amid this unrelenting despair, there were those who still dared to dream, who looked beyond the dirt and the drudgery and saw something more, something that flickered like a candle in the darkness, a fragile but unyielding hope that one day, somehow, things would change, though none could say how or when, for the wheels of history turned slowly, and the weight of the past was a burden not easily cast aside, a truth that young Alaric, the miller's son, was only beginning to understand as he stood at the edge of the village, his calloused hands gripping the rough wood of his father's plough, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun met the earth, a line as unattainable as the future he so desperately longed for, a future that seemed to slip further from his grasp with each passing day, as the world around him teetered on the brink of something vast and terrible, something that would soon sweep him up in its tide, whether he was ready or not. Chapter 2. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves through the narrow streets of Eldamere, where the villagers moved like shadows beneath the heavy grey sky, their faces drawn with the exhaustion of another day spent wresting sustenance from the unyielding land, their hands cracked and bleeding from the endless labor that began before sunrise and ended long after the last light had faded from the horizon, leaving them stumbling home in the dark, their bodies aching and their minds numb, too weary to do more than collapse onto their straw-filled pallets and pray for a few hours of dreamless sleep before the cycle began anew, a rhythm as unrelenting as the turning of the seasons, each one blending into the next with little to mark the passage of time save for the deepening lines on their faces and the slow hollowing of their cheeks, a gradual withering that none spoke of but all felt in the quiet moments when they caught their own reflections in the still waters of the village well, their sunken eyes staring back at them like those of strangers, ghosts of the people they might have been had fate dealt them a kinder hand, though such thoughts were dangerous, for they led to questions, and questions led to discontent, and discontent was a spark that could ignite a fire capable of consuming everything in its path, a truth that the elders knew well, which was why they discouraged idle wandering and instead urged the young to focus on the tasks at hand, to accept their lot with stoic resignation, for rebellion was a luxury the starving could not afford, and the last uprising had ended with the village square stained red and the heads of the ringleaders mounted on pikes as a warning to any who might dare to challenge the order of things, a lesson that had been seared into the collective memory of the people, who now moved through the days with bowed heads and silent tongues, their wills broken but their hearts still clinging to the faint, foolish hope that someday, somehow, the weight of their suffering would lessen, though they could not imagine how such a thing might come to pass, for the Lord in his stone manor atop the hill showed no mercy, his demands growing ever more insatiable as the years wore on, his greed a bottomless pit that swallowed everything the villages produced and still left him hungry for more, his cold eyes scanning the land like a vulture circling a dying beast, waiting for the moment it could descend and claim what little remained, a metaphor that Alaric had often turned over in his mind as he worked the fields, his muscles burning with the strain of labor that would never be his own, the fruits of his toil destined to fill the bellies of strangers while his own family scraped by on the barest scraps, a reality that filled him with a quiet, smoldering rage that he dared not voice, for words were dangerous, and he had seen what happened to those who spoke too freely, their bodies dragged away in the night, never to be seen again, their fates a whispered cautionary tale meant to keep the rest in line, a tactic that had worked for years, until the day the soldiers came again, their armor clanking as they marched into the village square, their faces obscured by the shadows of their helmets, their presence a dark omen that sent the villagers scattering like frightened mice, their hearts pounding as they waited to hear what fresh misery would be inflicted upon them this time, for the soldiers never came with good news, only demands and punishments, their boots kicking up dust as they moved through the crowd, their leader unfurling a scroll and reading aloud in a voice like grinding stone, his words sending a ripple of dread through the gathered people, for the taxes were to be doubled, and any who could not pay would forfeit their land, a death sentence in a world where the earth was all that stood between a man and starvation, a decree that left the villagers staring at one another in stunned silence, their minds racing as they tried to comprehend the enormity of what had just been announced, their futures crumbling before their eyes, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as the reality of their situation settled over them like a suffocating blanket, and in that moment, something shifted in Alaric, a spark of defiance flaring to life in the depths of his soul, a silent vow that he would not go quietly into the night, that he would not let his family be crushed beneath the heel of a lord who had never known hunger, who had never felt the bite of the winter wind through threadbare clothes, who had never watched a child wither away for want of food, and as the soldiers turned to leave, their message delivered, their cruelty dispensed with bureaucratic indifference, Alaric's fingers curled into fists at his sides, his jaw set with a determination that had not been there before, a resolve that would set him on a path from which there would be no turning back, though he did not yet know it, for the wheels of fate had begun to turn, and the quiet village of Eldamere would soon find itself at the center of a storm that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Chapter 3. The rain came that night, a torrential downpour that turned the dirt roads of Eldamere into rivers of mud, the water sluicing through the thatched roofs of the cottages and soaking the few meager possessions the villagers owned, the damp seeping into bones already weary from a lifetime of hardship, the cold and unwelcome companion to the gnawing hunger that kept them awake even as exhaustion threatened to pull them into oblivion, their thoughts a tangled mess of fear and desperation as they lay in the dark, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain against the walls, each drop a reminder of their helplessness in the face of forces greater than themselves, the storm outside mirroring the tempest brewing within their hearts, a growing sense of unrest that could no longer be contained by the old warnings and the fear of reprisal, for there came a point when a man had nothing left to lose, when the threat of death paled in comparison to the slow, grinding misery of a life without hope, a truth that was dawning on more than just Alaric as the night wore on, the villagers lying awake in their hovels, their minds turning over the same unspoken question, what now, the words hanging in the air like a spectre, demanding an answer that none of them yet had the courage to voice, for to speak it aloud would be to acknowledge that they had reached the brink, that the time for passive suffering had passed, and that the only choices left to them were to die on their knees or to risk everything in a final, desperate stand, a realization that settled over the village like a shroud, thick and suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on them until it seemed the very air was heavy with the unspoken resolve of people who had been pushed too far, their patience worn thin by years of indignities, their spirits hardened by the relentless cruelty of a world that had long since ceased to care whether they lived or died, and as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, pale and tentative, as if even the sun feared what the new day might bring, the people of Eldamere emerged from their homes, their faces set in grim determination, their eyes meeting in silent understanding, for the time had come to make a choice, and though the path ahead was fraught with peril, the alternative was no longer an option, and so, with a quiet steadiness that belied the fear churning in the guts, they began to gather in the square, their numbers growing with each passing moment, a silent assembly of the desperate and the defiant, their presence a wordless challenge to the powers that had ruled them for so long, a challenge that would not go unanswered, for history was not made by those who waited for change, but by those who dared to seize it, no matter the cost. Chapter 4. The murmur of voices in the square grew louder as the villagers of Eldamere gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resolve, their hands clenched into fists or clutching the few pitiful tools they had brought, rusty scythes, splintered wooden stakes, anything that could serve as a weapon against the armored might of the Lord's soldiers, though none dared to speak the truth aloud, that they were woefully unprepared for what was to come, that their rebellion was less a calculated strike and more the last, gasping defiance of cornered animals, a truth that hung heavy in the air even as they tried to convince themselves that they stood a chance, that the righteousness of their cause would somehow outweigh the cold steel and disciplined brutality of the men who had kept them in chains for generations, a delusion that Alaric himself was not immune to, standing at the edge of the crowd with his father's old wood axe in hand, its blade dull from years of disuse but still sharp enough to draw blood, a thought that sent a shiver down his spine even as he forced himself to stand tall, to meet the eyes of those around him, to project a confidence he did not feel, for if they faltered now, all would be lost, and so he swallowed the bile rising in his throat and stepped forward, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence like a knife, raw but steady as he spoke of the injustices they had endured, of the children who had starved while the Lord's granaries overflowed, of the men who had died in his mines and the women who had been dragged away to his bedchambers, never to return, his words igniting a fire in the hearts of those who listened, their murmurs turning to shouts, their fear hardening into anger, a living, breathing thing that pulsed through the crowd like a second heartbeat, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment until it seemed the very earth trembled beneath their feet, a force of nature that could not be contained, and then, as if summoned by the defiance, the sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, the rhythmic thud of approaching cavalry sending a ripple of panic through the villages, their makeshift weapons suddenly feeling absurdly inadequate in the face of the armored riders now visible on the horizon, their banners snapping in the wind, their lances gleaming like teeth in the pale morning light, a sight that would have sent them fleeing in terror mere days ago but now only tightened their resolve, for there was nowhere left to run, no surrender that would spare them, and so they stood the ground, a ragged line of desperation and fury, their breaths coming fast and shallow as the distance between them and the soldiers closed, the air thick with the scent of sweat and iron and the acrid tang of fear, the last moment of stillness before the storm broke, before the world erupted into chaos and blood and screams, before the fragile dream of freedom was either realized or crushed beneath the weight of the old order, and as the first arrow whistled through the air, Alaric knew, with a clarity that cut through the noise and the terror, that this day would be remembered, whether as a triumph or a massacre, and that history would be written by those who survived to tell the tale. Chapter 5. The clash was brutal and uneven, the villagers' ragged courage no match for the trained precision of the soldiers, who cut through them with methodical efficiency, their swords rising and falling in merciless arcs, each stroke painting the mud red with another life extinguished, the screams of the dying mingling with the shouts of the living, the air thick with the stench of blood and opened bowels, a cacophony of horror that seemed to stretch on forever, time itself slowing to a crawl as the battle, if it could even be called that, unfolded in a series of disjointed moments, each more terrible than the last, Alaric swinging his axe with numb desperation, the impact of the blade against flesh sending jolts up his arms, the warmth of blood splattering his face, the realization that he had just killed a man hitting him like a physical blow, his stomach heaving even as he forced himself to keep moving, to keep fighting, because to stop was to die, and he was not ready to die, not like this, not in the mud with the rest of them, their bodies piling up around him like broken dolls, their eyes staring sightlessly at the sky, their mouths frozen in final screams or silent prayers, the sheer scale of the slaughter overwhelming, the villagers' defiance crumbling beneath the relentless advance of the soldiers, who showed no mercy, their faces hidden behind helmets, their hearts as cold as the steel they wielded, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over, the survivors scattering like leaves in the wind, their rebellion crushed, their hope extinguished, the square littered with the dead and the dying, the soldiers standing victorious amidst the carnage, their chests heaving, their blades dripping, their commander surveying the scene with grim satisfaction before barking orders to round up the remaining troublemakers, to make sure the lesson was learned, to leave no doubt in the minds of the people that resistance was futile, that the order of things would not be challenged, not now, not ever. And as Alaric dragged himself away, his body aching, his soul shattered, he knew that this was not the end, that the fire that had been lit in his heart would not be so easily quenched, that the blood spilled today would demand an answer, and though he did not yet know how or when, he swore to himself, as he vanished into the woods like a ghost, that he would find a way to make them pay, to see the Lord's manor burn, to tear down the world that had allowed such cruelty to flourish, no matter the cost, no matter how long it took, for he had nothing left to lose, and a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing in the world. Chapter 6. The days that followed were a blur of pain and hunger, Alaric moving like a shadow through the forest, his body protesting every step, his wounds festering in the damp, his mind teetering on the edge of madness as the reality of his situation settled over him like a burial shroud, the weight of his failure pressing down on him until he could scarcely breathe, the faces of the dead haunting his every waking moment, their accusing stares following him even in the depths of his fitful sleep, their voices whispering in the rustling leaves and the creaking branches, a chorus of the fallen demanding vengeance, a demand he was powerless to answer, for what was he now but a fugitive, a nameless wretch with no home, no allies, no future, his existence reduced to the animalistic struggle for survival, each day a battle against the elements, against the gnawing emptiness in his belly, against the despair that threatened to swallow him whole, the forest itself seeming to conspire against him, its paths twisting and misleading, its creatures watching him with indifferent eyes, as if they knew he did not belong here, as if they were waiting for him to join the ranks of the dead, his body left to rot beneath the indifferent sky, his story forgotten before it had even truly begun, and yet, despite it all, he pressed on, driven by some stubborn spark within him that refused to be extinguished, some foolish, stubborn hope that there was still a way forward, that the world was not yet done with him, a hope that was rewarded one evening when he stumbled upon a campfire in the depths of the woods, its glow a beacon in the gathering dark, the smell of cooking meat making his stomach clench with painful longing, his instincts warring between the urge to flee and the desperate need to approach, to beg for scraps, to feel the warmth of human company. Again, if only for a moment, and after a long, agonizing hesitation, he chose the latter, stepping into the circle of light with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, his voice a hoarse croak as he pleaded for mercy, his vision swimming with exhaustion and hunger, the figures around the fire turning to face him with expressions he could not read, their weapons glinting in the firelight, their silence more terrifying than any threat, and then, just as he felt his legs giving way beneath him, one of them stepped forward, a grizzled man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held neither pity nor cruelty, only a weary understanding, and in that moment, Alaric knew that his life had changed once again, that this meeting was no accident, that the threads of fate had woven him into a larger tapestry, one whose pattern he could not yet see, but whose design would shape the rest of his days, for better or for worse. Chapter 7. The outlaws took him in, not out of kindness. There was little of that to be found in the lawless corners of the kingdom, but because a man with nothing to lose was a useful thing, his desperation making him willing to do what others would not, his hatred of the Lord and his soldiers ensuring his loyalty, at least for now, and Sir Alaric found himself among them, these hardened men and women who lived outside the bounds of society, the names struck from the records, their faces known only on wanted posters nailed to tavern walls, their lives a constant dance with death, their code a simple one: take what you can, give nothing back, kill if you must, and trust no one. Lessons that Alaric learned quickly, his softness burned away by the brutality of his new existence, his hands growing callous not from the plough but from the sword, his heart hardening with each passing day, each new atrocity witnessed, each line crossed without hesitation. The boy he had been fading into memory, replaced by something colder, sharper, more dangerous, a transformation that should have troubled him but instead felt like a relief, for in this world, mercy was weakness, and weakness got you killed, a truth that was driven home the first time he slit a man's throat, the hot rush of blood over his fingers, the way the light left the man's eyes so quickly, as if it had never been there at all, the realization that taking a life was disturbingly easy, that the line between murderer and survivor was thinner than he had ever imagined, a revelation that should have haunted him but instead settled into his bones like a familiar weight, another step on the path he had chosen, or perhaps the path that had chosen him, for he was no longer certain there was a difference, the days blurring together into a haze of violence and survival, the camp becoming his only home, the outlaws his only family, their rough camaraderie a poor substitute for what he had lost but better than the yawning emptiness of solitude, their leader, the grizzled man who had spared him that first night, becoming something like a father to him, teaching him the ways of the blade and the bow, the art of ambush and escape, the delicate balance of fear and respect that kept a band of cutthroats in line, lessons that Alaric absorbed with a hunger that surprised even himself, his natural aptitude for violence both disturbing and exhilarating, the ease with which he adapted to this life making him wonder if he had always been meant for it, if the quiet, dutiful son of a miller had been nothing more than a mask, one that had been torn away to reveal the truth beneath, a truth that was as ugly as it was liberating. And as the months passed, and his reputation grew, he began to understand that he would never go back, that the man he had been was dead, and that the man he was becoming would leave his mark on the world, one way or another. Chapter 8. The first snows came early that year, a brutal onslaught of white that buried the remnants of the harvest and sealed the fate of those villages too slow to appease the tax collectors, their stores already emptied by the Lord's insatiable demands, their people now left to face the long winter with nothing but desperation and prayer, though the gods had long since turned their backs on this wretched land, their silence a confirmation of what the people had begun to suspect, that they were alone in their suffering, that no divine hand would intervene to stay the cruelty of men, a realization that festered in the hearts of the survivors like an open wound, festering and untended, their faith crumbling like rotted wood beneath the weight of their anguish, their whispered pleas for mercy unanswered as the cold tightened its grip, the weak and the elderly succumbing first, their bodies stiffening in the night, their final breaths steaming in the frigid air before vanishing as if they had never been, the children following soon after, their hollowed faces too still in death, their bellies swollen with hunger, their tiny hands clutching at nothing as they were buried in shallow graves that the frozen earth scarcely allowed, the survivors too numb with grief and cold to weep, their tears frozen on their cheeks like tiny scars, their world reduced to the endless struggle for one more day, one more hour, one more breath, the once familiar landscape now a featureless void of white and grey, the roads impassable, the villages cut off from one another, each left to wither in isolation, the usual winter murmurs of rebellion stifled beneath the weight of the snow and the ever-present fear that the Lord's men would come anyway, would demand what little remained, would take the last ember of warmth from the hearth and leave them to die in the dark, a fear that proved justified when riders were spotted on the horizon, the dark shapes moving against the endless white like carrion birds, their purpose unmistakable even at a distance, their arrival sending the villagers scrambling to hide what meager supplies they had left, their hearts pounding with a terror that had become as much a part of them as their own breath, the knowledge that resistance was impossible, doing nothing to quell the hatred that burned in their chests, a hatred that would outlast the winter, that would fester and grow until it became something monstrous, something that could no longer be contained, though for now it remained buried beneath the snow, waiting for the thaw, waiting for the moment when it could rise again, bloodied and vengeful, to claim what was owed. Chapter 9. The outlaws' camp fared little better than the villages, the relentless cold driving them deeper into the forest, the usual haunts abandoned in favor of caves and hollows that offered scant protection from the elements, their fires kept low to avoid drawing attention, the smoke dissipating into the leaden sky like the last sighs of the dying, their numbers dwindling as the weeks wore on, the weak and the wounded slipping away in the night, their bodies left where they fell, the ground too hard to dig, the living too exhausted to mourn, their existence reduced to a ceaseless grind of hunger and cold and watchfulness, the fear of discovery a constant companion, for the Lord's bounty on their heads had doubled with the season, the promise of gold enough to turn even desperate men into informants, their loyalty as brittle as the ice that coated the branches, the trust between the outlaws fraying like old rope, each man eyeing the other with suspicion, each wondering who might betray them first, the tension a living thing in the air. Thick enough to choke on, the leader's authority fraying at the edges as the days passed, his commands met with sullen silence or muttered dissent, the once unshakable bonds of their brotherhood cracking under the strain, the camp teetering on the brink of chaos, a single spark away from imploding, a reality that Alaric observed with detached clarity, his own survival instincts honed to a razor's edge, his movements careful, his words measured, his loyalty a carefully cultivated illusion, for he had learned the hard way that in this world, the only person you could trust was yourself, a lesson that had been driven home the night he found one of his supposed brothers going through his meager belongings, the man's fingers closing around the last crust of bread he had been saving, the look in his eyes not even one of guilt but of simple, animal need, the understanding passing between them in that moment wordless and absolute, that this was what they had been reduced to, that the veneer of civilization had been stripped away to reveal the savagery beneath, that in the end, it was every man for himself, a truth that Alaric acknowledged with a slow nod before driving his knife into the man's throat, the hot rush of blood over his hands a grim confirmation of what he had long suspected, that he was capable of this, that the line between man and monster was thinner than he had ever imagined, and as he wiped his blade clean on the dead man's shirt, he felt no remorse, only a cold certainty that this was the way of the world, and that he would do what he must to survive it. Chapter 10. The thaw, when it came, was a slow and grudging thing, the snow receding inch by tortuous inch, the land beneath it revealed sodden and lifeless, the rivers swollen with meltwater, their currents treacherous with hidden debris, the roads reduced to quagmires that swallowed carts and travelers alike, the season of mud and misery dragging on with no end in sight, the people emerging from their hovels like creatures from a long hibernation, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, their movements sluggish with the lingering effects of near starvation, the villagers silent but for the occasional wail of grief as the full extent of the winter's toll became apparent, the bodies of those who had not survived the cold now revealed by the retreating snow, their stiffened forms arranged in grotesque parody of sleep, the skin bleached white by the elements, their mouths frozen in silent screams, the sight of them a grim reminder of how close they all had come to sharing that fate, the survivors moving among them with grim efficiency, their emotions buried beneath the weight of necessity, for there was no time to mourn, not when the planting season was already upon them, not when the Lord's men would soon come demanding the due, not when the spectre of another winter loomed on the horizon, its inevitability a crushing weight on their already broken spirits, the cyclical nature of their suffering a torment in itself, the knowledge that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they bled, it would never be enough, that they were trapped in an endless loop of toil and deprivation, their lives measured out in seasons of want, their futures as barren as the fields they struggled to revive, the injustice of it a bitter pill to swallow, though swallow it they must, for what other choice did they have? Chapter 11. The spring rains fell in relentless sheets, turning the already sodden earth into a quagmire that sucked at boots and hooves with equal indifference, the villagers wading through the muck with the grim determination of those who knew their survival depended on forcing life back into the unyielding soil, their hands cracked and bleeding from days spent dragging stones from fields that had lain fallow too long, their backs bent beneath the weight of labor that never eased, only shifted from one form of drudgery to another, the seasons changing but the suffering remaining constant, an unbroken chain of toil stretching back generations and forward into a future that promised no reprieve, the children who had survived the winter set to work alongside their elders, their small frames ill-suited to the tasks but given no choice, for hunger was a harsh teacher and mercy a luxury none could afford, their eyes already old with the knowledge that this was all there would ever be for them, their dreams as stunted as the crops struggling to take root in the nutrient-starved earth, the occasional glimmer of green amidst the brown of fragile hope that was more reflex than belief, for they had been disappointed too many times to trust in anything but the certainty of suffering, their prayers to gods they no longer believed in whispered more out of habit than faith, the words empty vessels carrying nothing but the echoes of dead hopes, the world around them indifferent to their struggles, the sun rising and setting with mechanical regularity, the stars wheeling overhead in patterns that had not changed since the beginning of time, their constancy a mockery of the fleeting, insignificant lives playing out beneath them, the villages as ephemeral as the morning mist, here one moment and gone the next, their passing unremarked by anyone but those who had known them, and even those memories would fade with time, leaving no trace that they had ever existed at all. Chapter 12. Word of the failed rebellion had spread through the countryside like a plague, carried by travelers who spoke in hushed tones of the bodies left to rot in Eldamere Square, of the screams that had echoed through the valley for days after as the Lord's men made examples of those suspected of sympathizing with the insurgents, their methods creative and brutal, designed to break not just bones but spirits, to stamp out any ember of resistance before it could catch fire. The lessons taught in blood and pain meant to ensure compliance for generations to come, the stories growing in the telling until they took on the quality of myth, the rebels transformed in death into something larger than life, the doomed stand against tyranny becoming a cautionary tale whispered to children to keep them in line, the moral always the same: defiance leads only to suffering, obedience is the only path to survival, a lesson that was being reinforced even now as the tax collectors made their rounds, their ledgers filled with fresh demands, their armed escorts a silent reminder of the consequences of refusal, the villagers handing over what little they had with bowed heads and empty stomachs, their resentment a living thing that grew with each passing day, fed by every stolen crust of bread, every child sent to bed crying from hunger, every night spent listening to the sounds of the Lord's feasts drifting down from the manor on the hill, the laughter and music a dagger twisting in already raw wounds, the injustice of it a poison that seeped into their bones and festered there, waiting for the right moment to erupt, though none could say when that moment might come, or if they would even live to see it, the weight of their powerlessness a yoke they had worn so long it had become part of them, as natural as breathing, the idea of freedom a distant dream that belonged to other people in other places, not to them, never to them. Chapter 13. Alaric moved through the forest like a ghost, his footsteps silent on the damp earth, his senses attuned to every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, the woods alive with sounds that would have gone unnoticed by city dwellers but to him spoke as clearly as words, the language of the wild one he had learned out of necessity, each creak and whisper a potential threat or opportunity, his survival depending on his ability to read them correctly, the months since the massacre having honed him into something both more and less than human, his body lean and hard from constant movement and too little food, his mind sharpened by the ever-present need to stay one step ahead of pursuit, his soul hardened by the things he had done to stay alive, the lines he had crossed without hesitation when the alternative was death, the memories of those choices lurking at the edges of his consciousness like shadows, waiting for the moments when his guard was down to remind him of what he had become, though he pushed them away with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to all weakness, for sentiment was a luxury he could no longer afford, not when every day was a battle against the elements, against hunger, against the men who still hunted him, the determination to see him dead undimmed by time, the price on his head enough to tempt even honest men into betrayal, forcing him to trust no one, to sleep with one eye open, to keep moving even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, the forest his only ally, its endless expanse offering both sanctuary and prison, a green hell that had saved his life even as it stole pieces of his humanity, the boy he had been fading further into memory with each passing day, replaced by this hardened creature of instinct and survival, a transformation that was nearly complete, the last vestiges of his old self clinging stubbornly to life like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood, though even that grip was weakening, the current of his new existence too strong to resist, pulling him inexorably toward a destination he could not yet see but knew awaited him all the same. Chapter 14. The first caravan of the season appeared on the road like a mirage, its brightly colored wagons a splash of vibrancy against the drab landscape, the merchants within oblivious to the suffering that surrounded them, their fat faces flushed with good living, their laughter carrying on the wind like the tinkling of coins, their wealth evident in every stitch of their fine clothes, every jewel that glittered on their fingers, every piece of silver that adorned their belts, the sight of such opulence a slap in the face to those who had nothing, the villagers watching from a distance with a mixture of awe and hatred, their fingers itching to take what they could, their minds conjuring images of what even a fraction of that wealth could do for their families, the fantasies as intoxicating as they were dangerous, for the merchants traveled with guards, hard-eyed men who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation, their swords well-oiled and sharp, their crossbows loaded and ready, the message clear: try to take what isn't yours, and you'll die where you stand, a warning that kept most at bay, though not all, the desperate and the reckless still willing to risk everything for a chance at something better, their attempts invariably ending in bloodshed, their bodies left by the roadside as examples to others, the merchants moving on without a backward glance, their consciences untroubled by the lives they had taken, for what were a few peasants compared to the profits they stood to make, their ledgers filled with numbers that meant nothing to those who couldn't read them, their world one of balance sheets and percentages, of margins and investments, a world as foreign to the villages as the moon, the divide between them unbridgeable, the idea that they were all part of the same kingdom a bitter joke that no one found funny. Chapter 15. The Outlaws. Struck at dawn, their attack as sudden as a summer storm, their faces covered with scraps of cloth to hide their identities, though most would have been unrecognizable anyway, the hardships of their existence having erased whatever softness they might once have possessed, leaving behind only the hard angles and sharp edges of men who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back, their weapons crude but effective, their tactics born of desperation rather than training, their numbers just enough to overwhelm the guards before they could properly organize a defense, the element of surprise the greatest ally, the chaos of those first moments allowing them to cut down several of the armed men before the rest could react, the fighting fierce and brutal, no quarter asked or given, the outlaws fighting like demons possessed, their fury fueled by months of deprivation and the knowledge that failure meant death, their opponents no less determined, their professionalism gradually telling as they began to regain control of the situation, the disciplined ranks closing around the raiders like a vice, the tide of battle turning with a speed that was almost graceful, the outlaws finding themselves suddenly on the defensive, their initial advantage slipping through their fingers like sand, their casualties mounting with each passing second, the ground beneath their feet slick with blood, their breathing ragged with exertion and fear, the realization dawning that they had underestimated their prey, that this would not be the easy victory they had imagined, that some of them would not live to see another sunrise, the knowledge lending a frantic edge to their movements, their attacks growing wilder, less coordinated, their cohesion crumbling under the relentless pressure of the guards' counter-assault, the battle degenerating into a series of individual struggles, each man fighting for his life with no thought for his comrades, the once clear lines between friend and foe blurring in the confusion, the air thick with the sounds of steel on steel, of screams and curses and the wet thud of blades finding flesh, the stench of blood and opened bowels overwhelming, the scene one of pure carnage, a microcosm of the larger conflict that raged across the kingdom, the strong preying on the weak, the desperate lashing out at those they perceived as their oppressors, the cycle of violence unbroken and seemingly unbreakable, the roots of the conflict buried so deep in history that none could remember a time before it, the idea of peace as fantastical as the stories of dragons and knights that traveling minstrels sometimes sang about, the reality far uglier and more intractable than any tale. Chapter 16. The aftermath of the failed raid lay heavy in the air, the scent of blood and smoke clinging to the trampled earth where the outlaws had made their stand, their bodies now strewn across the road like discarded puppets, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles, their eyes staring blankly at the sky, the guards moving among them with methodical efficiency, ensuring none still drew breath before turning their attention to looting the dead, their laughter coarse and unfeeling as they stripped the corpses of anything valuable, their callousness a stark reminder of the world's indifference to suffering, the merchants watching from a safe distance, their faces pale but their hands steady as they tallied their losses and calculated the cost of replacing what had been stolen, their concern not for the lives lost but for the delay this would cause to their schedule, the inconvenience of it all more troubling to them than the violence itself, their priorities a reflection of the values that governed their world, where profit outweighed humanity and time was a currency more precious than gold, the surviving outlaws, those few who had managed to flee, now scattered like leaves in the wind, their numbers diminished, their morale shattered, their future uncertain, the knowledge that they had gambled and lost weighing heavily on them as they limped back to their hidden camps, their wounds untreated, their spirits broken, the reality of their situation crashing down upon them with brutal clarity, for they were not the heroes of some grand tale but desperate men who had tried and failed to change their circumstances, the defeat a lesson in the futility of resistance, the odds stacked so heavily against them that even their boldest efforts amounted to nothing, the world grinding them beneath its heel without a second thought, their existence insignificant in the grand scheme of things, their struggles meaningless to anyone but themselves, a truth that was as inescapable as it was cruel. Chapter 17. Alaric had not been among the raiders, his instincts warning him away from the venture, a gut feeling that had saved his life yet again, though it did little to ease the bitterness that coiled in his chest as he surveyed the remnants of his band, the once proud outlaws now reduced to a handful of broken men, their eyes hollow with defeat, their bodies bearing the marks of their failure, the camp that had once buzzed with activity now eerily silent, the usual banter and boasts replaced by a grim acceptance of their new reality, the leader's authority crumbling like dry clay, his once commanding presence diminished by the weight of his miscalculation, the trust his followers had placed in him now replaced by a resentment that simmered just beneath the surface, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air, that he had led them to ruin, that his ambition had outstripped his judgment, that they had followed him to the brink of destruction and found nothing but ashes on the other side, a truth that even he could not deny, though he lacked the courage to voice it aloud, his pride a brittle shield against the condemnation of his men, his silence as damning as any confession, the tension in the camp thickening with each passing hour, the bonds that had held them together fraying under the strain, the question of what came next looming over them like a storm cloud, for they could not stay here, not with the Lord's men undoubtedly scouring the woods for survivors, not with their supplies dwindling and their strength waning, not with the rot of failure eating away at what little cohesion remained, the knowledge that they would have to disband, to scatter to the winds, to abandon the fragile brotherhood they had built, a bitter pill to swallow, yet one that was becoming increasingly unavoidable, the end of the brief rebellion as inevitable as the setting sun, their dreams of striking back at the world that had wronged them dissolving into nothingness, their legacy nothing but another cautionary tale in a land already overflowing with them. Chapter 18. The decision to part ways came not with a bang but a whimper, the outlaws slipping away one by one under cover of darkness, their departures unannounced, the goodbyes left unspoken, the understanding between them wordless and absolute, that this was the end, that whatever bond they had shared had been severed by the events of the past days, that to linger was to invite death, a fate none were eager to meet, not like this, not after everything they had endured, their vanishing acts as quiet as their presences had once been loud, the camp emptying with a speed that was almost surreal, the fire pit cold and abandoned, the makeshift shelters stripped of anything useful, the ground trampled and littered with the detritus of their time together, the only evidence that they had ever been here at all, the forest reclaiming the space with a swiftness that spoke to the impermanence of all things, the vines and undergrowth already creeping back to fill the void left by their passing, nature indifferent to the dramas of men, its cycles unbroken by the petty conflicts of those who walked upon its surface, the outlaws' existence as fleeting as the morning mist, their impact on the world negligible, their stories destined to fade into obscurity, the names forgotten by all but the few who had known them, and even those memories would soon dim, the passage of time erasing what little mark they had left behind, the world moving on without them, as it always did, as it always would, the lesson a harsh one but an undeniable truth, that in the end, they had changed nothing, that the machine of the world had ground them beneath its gears without so much as a hiccup, that the defiance had been as meaningless as the wind howling through the trees, loud and fierce in the moment but gone without a trace the next. Chapter 19. Alaric was the last to leave, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he moved through the abandoned camp, his eyes scanning the empty spaces where his companions had once slept and laughed and dreamed of a better future, the silence pressing in on him like a physical weight, the solitude a stark contrast to the camaraderie he had grown accustomed to, the absence of the others a gaping hole in his world, one he was not sure how to fill, his mind turning over the events that had led them here, the choices that had brought him to this point, the mistakes that had cost so many their lives, the weight of it all a burden he was not certain he could bear, though bear it he must, for there was no one left to share the load, no brothers in arms to lean on, no leader to follow, only himself and the endless stretch of wilderness ahead, the path forward unclear, his options limited, his future uncertain, the realization that he was truly alone for the first time since the massacre in Eldamere settling over him like a shroud, the enormity of it threatening to crush him, though he refused to let it, his jaw tightening with resolve, his grip on his weapon firming, his steps becoming more sure as he pushed forward, away from the past and into the unknown, for what else was there to do but keep moving, to keep fighting, to keep surviving, even when the world seemed determined to break him, even when every step felt like a battle, even when the weight of his losses threatened to drag him under. The fire in his chest, the same fire that had kept him alive through the winter, through the bloodshed, through the betrayals, burning as brightly as ever, a beacon in the darkness, a promise to himself that he would not give up, not now, not ever, no matter what lay ahead. Chapter 20. The road was a dangerous place for a man with a price on his head, every traveler a potential informant, every village a potential trap, every shadow a potential ambush, the constant threat of discovery a gnawing presence at the back of Alaric's mind, his senses perpetually on high alert, his body thrumming with tension, his sleep fitful and shallow, his dreams haunted by the faces of the dead, their accusing stares following him even in the depths of his exhaustion, their whispers a constant refrain in his ears, a chorus of the fallen demanding vengeance, a demand he was powerless to answer, for what was he now but a fugitive, a ghost drifting through a world that had no place for him, his existence reduced to the barest essentials, food, shelter, survival, the higher aspirations he had once harbored ground to dust beneath the relentless march of time and circumstance, his hopes as distant as the stars, his purpose unclear, his path uncharted, the days blending together into a monotonous stream of hunger and weariness and fear, the landscape around him changing but his circumstances remaining stubbornly the same, the road stretching endlessly ahead, each mile as indistinguishable as the last, the journey a metaphor for his life, directionless, unending, devoid of meaning, the weight of it all pressing down on him until he could scarcely breathe, the urge to simply lie down and let the world pass him by, a constant temptation, one he resisted only through sheer force of will, the stubborn refusal to surrender the last vestige of his identity, the final ember of the man he had once been, the spark that refused to be extinguished no matter how fiercely the winds of fate howled around it, a small, defiant light in the encroaching darkness. Chapter 21. The first village Alaric dared approach after weeks of wandering lay nestled in a valley like a wounded animal curled in on itself, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of perpetual dampness, its fields struggling against the chokehold of weeds that had overtaken the untended soil, the people moving through the daily routines with the mechanical precision of those long accustomed to despair, their eyes downcast, their shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow at any moment, the air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and the acrid tang of desperation that clung to everything like a second skin, the sight of them a mirror of his own wretchedness, though they at least had the dubious comfort of walls and hearts while he had nothing but the clothes on his back and the knife at his belt, the risk of revealing himself warring with the gnawing emptiness in his gut that had become his constant companion, the decision to step out of the tree line made not out of courage but necessity, his body moving before his mind could conjure up another reason to stay hidden, his appearance causing an immediate ripple of tension through the villagers who froze mid-motion like deer sensing a predator, the collective breath held as they took in his ragged appearance, the hardness in his eyes that spoke of things they could only imagine, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire ready to snap until an old woman broke it by wordlessly holding out a crust of bread, her gnarled fingers trembling but her gaze steady, an unspoken understanding passing between them that he was no threat to them, not really, just another lost soul caught in the same unforgiving machine that had been grinding them down for generations, the bread stale and moldy, but to him it might as well have been a feast, the simple act of charity nearly undoing him as he took it with hands that shook not from weakness but from the unexpected kindness in a world that had shown him none, the moments stretching between them fragile and fleeting before the village returned to its business and he to the shadows, the bread sitting like a stone in his stomach, the taste of it bittersweet with the knowledge that for all their suffering these people still had room in their hearts for mercy while his had grown as hard and barren as the wasteland he now called home. Chapter 22. The rumors reached him in bits and pieces, passed along by travelers too weary to care who might be listening or by farmers whose tongues had been loosened by cheap ale, whispers of unrest in the north where the Lord's grip had always been weakest, of entire villages rising up and casting off the chains, of tax collectors found hanging from trees with their ledgers stuffed down the throats, the stories growing wilder with each retelling until it was impossible to separate truth from fantasy, but the underlying current remained the same. Something was stirring in the kingdom, a restlessness that could no longer be contained by fear or force, the embers of rebellion fanned into flames by years of oppression and the particularly brutal winter that had followed. The people pushed past the point of endurance and into the uncharted territory of collective rage, the idea of it sending a thrill through Alaric that he hadn't felt since before the massacre, the possibility that he might not be alone in his hatred of the world as it was, that others too had reached the breaking point and were ready to tear it all down with the bare hands if necessary, the thought intoxicating enough to momentarily eclipse the ever-present hunger and exhaustion, his mind racing with half-formed plans and reckless notions, the map of his future redrawn in an instant by these fragmented reports, the decision to head north not so much made as felt in his bones, an instinctive pull toward the chaos that might finally provide the purpose he'd been lacking since the day he'd lost everything, his path suddenly clear where before there had been only aimless wandering, the road ahead no less dangerous but now bristling with possibility where before there had been none, his steps quickening of their own accord as if he could already smell the smoke on the horizon, the distant echoes of upheaval calling to him like a siren's song, irresistible and perilous in equal measure. Chapter 23. The landscape changed as he moved northward, the dense forests giving way to rolling hills scarred by the blackened remains of what had once been farmsteads, the air carrying the faint but unmistakable scent of charred wood and something darker beneath it, the signs of recent violence everywhere if one knew how to look, the hastily dug graves at the edges of fields, the fresh notches in tree trunks where blades had been tested, the occasional glint of metal in the underbrush where some discarded weapon lay waiting to be found, the tension in the countryside so thick it could be tasted like copper on the tongue, every village he passed through bristling with a newfound defiance that manifested in the way the people held themselves, their backs straighter, their eyes meeting his with something approaching recognition rather than fear, the unspoken question hanging between them, are you with us or against us, the wrong answer likely to earn him a knife between the ribs, the rules of engagement rewritten in blood while he'd been skulking in the wilderness, the balance of power shifting in ways both subtle and seismic, the old order crumbling at the edges though its center still held firm for now, the Lord's soldiers a more frequent presence on the roads but moving in larger groups than before, their confidence shaken by the unpredictability of the resistance they faced, the usual tactics of intimidation falling flat against opponents who had already stared death in the face and found they had nothing left to lose, the cat-and-mouse game between oppressor and oppressed reaching a fever pitch with neither side willing to back down, the kingdom teetering on the brink of something that could either be liberation or annihilation depending on who held the pen when the history of these days was finally written, if anyone survived to write it at all. Chapter 24. He found the rebels, or perhaps they found him, in the ruins of a monastery that had been sacked years before during one of the many purges, its once sacred halls now home to a different kind of fervor, the walls scrawled with crude slogans and the names of those who had fallen in the struggle, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the sharp tang of weapon oil, the men and women who called this place home a far cry from the desperate bandits he'd run with before, their eyes alight with a purpose that went beyond mere survival, their talk not of loot or revenge but of justice and a future worth fighting for, the idealism of it almost laughable if not for the hardened edges of the people espousing it, their hands as calloused as any farmer's but the grips firm with conviction, their leader a former blacksmith whose massive frame bore the scars of his time in the Lord's dungeons, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority earned through suffering rather than birthright, his words simple but potent as he laid out the vision for what came after the fighting was done, the world they hoped to build from the ashes of the old one, the earnestness of it striking a chord in Alaric that he hadn't known still existed, the part of him that had once believed in something more than his own survival stirring to life like a limb gone numb from disuse, the offer to join him extended without ceremony or expectation, the choice his alone to make though the unspoken understanding was that there would be no walking away once committed, the cause too important, the stakes too high for half measures or fair weather allies, the moments stretching between them as he weighed the decision that would define whatever life he had left, the silence broken only by the distant cry of a crow and the steady drip of water from the broken roof, the world itself seeming to hold its breath as he reached for the knife at his belt and drove it into the wooden table between them, the blade quivering with the force of the impact, his answer given not in words but in action, the line crossed, the die cast, the point of no return left far behind in the dust of his past. Chapter 25. The first real battle came sooner than expected, the Lord's forces having finally tracked the rebels to their hideout and moving in under cover of darkness, their approach masked by a summer storm that turned the ground to slick mud beneath their boots, the sentries taken out with silent efficiency before they could raise the alarm, the attack beginning in earnest as the first streaks of dawn painted the sky in hues of blood and bruises, the rebels scrambling from their makeshift beds to meet the onslaught with whatever weapons they could grab, the chaos absolute in those first moments, the air filled with screams and the clash of steel on steel, the rain coming down in sheets that turned the battlefield into a nightmarish tableau of slipping and stumbling combatants, every advantage the rebels might have had in numbers or terrain negated by the sheer discipline of their opponents, the fight quickly devolving into a series of brutal skirmishes where survival depended more on luck than skill, Alaric moving through the carnage with a single-minded focus he hadn't known he possessed, his blade finding flesh again and again, the heat of battle burning away any last vestiges of hesitation or remorse, the man he'd been before this moment dying as surely as the men falling beneath his knife, his world reduced to the next enemy, the next kill, the next breath, the stench of blood and voided bowels thick in his nostrils, the sounds of the dying a symphony of agony that would haunt him for the rest of his days, the knowledge that this was only the beginning doing nothing to lessen the horror of it all, the rebellion baptized in fire and suffering before it had even properly begun, the cost of defiance measured in broken bodies and extinguished lives, the lesson clear for those who survived to learn it, that freedom was never given, only taken, and the price was always paid in blood. Chapter 26. The rain continued to fall long after the fighting had ended, the downpour washing the blood from the ruins of the monastery in thin pink rivulets that snaked through the mud like veins ripped from some dying beast, the bodies of the fallen left where they lay as the survivors regrouped in what remained of the cellar, their numbers halved in a single morning, the air thick with the stench of wet wool and fresh wounds, the moans of the injured a constant undercurrent to the hushed discussions of strategy, the blacksmith turned leader moving among them with a grim determination that belied the exhaustion in his eyes, his voice steady as he outlined the next moves though the plan had clearly changed in the wake of this disaster, the need for secrecy now paramount, the luxury of a fixed base of operations no longer feasible, the rebels would have to scatter into smaller cells, become ghosts in the countryside, striking where they could before vanishing back into the populace, the war shifting from open confrontation to something slower, more insidious, a campaign of attrition that would test their resolve in ways none of them could yet imagine, the faces around the circle hardening as the reality of their situation settled over them, the romantic notions of glorious revolution replaced by the cold calculus of survival and sacrifice, the understanding that many of them would not live to see the world they were fighting for, that the names might be forgotten even if their cause prevailed, the weight of it pressing down on them all until one of the younger rebels, a girl barely old enough to have left home, began to sob quietly, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife, the blacksmith's hand coming to rest on her shoulder with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his massive frame, his words simple but carrying the weight of truth, "We cry now so we won't have to later," the sentiment hanging in the air as the others took it in, the moment stretching before Alaric found himself speaking without thinking, his voice rough from disuse but steady as he recounted the massacre at Eldamere, the failed raid, the months of running, the lesson he'd learned through blood and loss, that the world only changed when people refused to stay broken, the words landing with more impact than he'd intended, the silence that followed thick with something approaching reverence before the blacksmith nodded once and began assigning tasks, the rebellion reforged in that moment, smaller but sharper, its purpose distilled to its essence, not to win, but to endure, to become the kind of problem that couldn't be solved with swords and scaffolds, the kind of idea that outlived the men who carried it. Chapter 27. The next months passed in a blur of movement and violence, Alaric's world shrinking to the radius of whatever cell he'd been assigned to, their operations growing more audacious as their understanding of asymmetric warfare deepened, the lessons of the monastery massacre burned into the collective psyche, never stay in one place too long, never trust a stranger, never attack where expected, their tactics evolving to exploit the weaknesses of a system that had grown fat on predictability, the ambushes along supply routes, the sabotage of mills and storehouses, the carefully timed assassinations of minor officials whose disappearances would cause maximum disruption with minimal risk, the slow strangulation of the Lord's ability to govern his own lands, the invisible war fought in shadows and whispers, the countryside transforming into a patchwork of loyalist strongholds and rebel sympathizers, the lines between them increasingly blurred as the conflict dragged on, the civilian population caught in the middle, their allegiances shifting with the wind, their survival depending on an ability to read the tides of power before they turned, the once clear divisions between friend and foe rendered meaningless by the complexity of human nature, the rebels. Learning hard lessons about trust and betrayal, about the lengths people would go to protect what little they had, about the corrosive effects of prolonged conflict on even the most righteous cause, Alaric himself changing in ways he couldn't have anticipated, the soft-spoken miller's son now a seasoned guerrilla whose name was whispered in taverns and lordly chambers alike, his reputation growing with each successful operation, the legend outpacing the man until he scarcely recognized himself in the stories, the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders almost without his noticing, the others looking to him for guidance as the blacksmith's influence waned, the natural order of things asserting itself in the absence of formal hierarchy, the rebellion becoming something more than a collection of angry peasants. It was becoming an army, and Alaric, despite his protests, was becoming its general. Chapter 28. The Lord's response, when it finally came, was as brutal as it was predictable. Collective punishment on a scale not seen since the purges of his grandfather's time, entire villages put to the torch on the mere suspicion of harboring rebels, the bodies left to rot in the sun as a warning to others, the roads lined with gibbets where men and women swung like macabre wind chimes, their crimes written on placards that none could read but all understood, the terror campaign designed to break the spirit of the countryside once and for all, the message clear, submit or be erased, the strategy backfiring spectacularly as those who had remained neutral now flocked to the rebellion in droves, their fear transformed into fury by the sheer indiscriminate nature of the violence, the Lord's heavy hand creating more rebels than it eliminated, the ranks swelling with fresh recruits eager to revenge their loved ones, the rebellion gaining momentum even as its enemies multiplied, the delicate balance of power shifting day by day, the once unthinkable idea of victory now whispered in corners where before there had been only talk of survival, the mood among the rebels shifting accordingly, their strikes growing bolder, their numbers allowing them to take and hold territory for the first time, the Lord's forces finding themselves stretched thin trying to contain a fire that had jumped every line they'd drawn, the war entering a new phase where neither side could claim clear advantage, the stalemate breeding a peculiar kind of tension, the calm before some inevitable storm that all could feel coming but none could predict, the kingdom holding its breath as the two sides circled each other like wounded beasts, each waiting for the other to make the mistake that would decide everything. Chapter 29. The dreams started around this time, vivid, suffocating things that left Alaric gasping awake in the dead of night, his body drenched in sweat despite the autumn chill, the images lingering behind his eyelids like after-images of lightning strikes, always variations on the same theme, Eldamere burning, the faces of the dead floating in the smoke, their mouths moving in silent accusation, their hands reaching for him with fingers like charred twigs, the nightmares so intense that he took to sleeping only in daylight hours when exhaustion overcame him, his nights spent pacing the perimeter of whatever makeshift camp they'd established, his mind racing with strategies and contingencies, the weight of command pressing down on him with increasing intensity as the rebellion's successes mounted, the paradox of leadership becoming clearer with each passing day, the more they won, the more he stood to lose, the lives entrusted to him a burden he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse, the responsibility carving lines into his face that made him look a decade older than his years, the boy he'd been a distant memory, the man he'd become a stranger even to himself, the transformation complete in every way but one. He still flinched at the sound of children laughing, the innocence of it a reminder of everything the war had stolen, not just from him but from an entire generation that would grow up knowing nothing but conflict, their childhood sacrificed on the altar of a future they might never live to see, the thought keeping him awake more effectively than any nightmare. The cost of their cause tallied not in territory gained or enemies killed but in the quiet moments of normalcy that would never be reclaimed, the ledger of war balanced in currencies more precious than gold, the final accounting still to come. Chapter 30. The first snow found the rebels in control of nearly a third of the county, their influence radiating outward from the liberated zones like ripples in a pond, the Lord's forces increasingly confined to the major towns and fortifications, their supply lines stretched to breaking point, their morale crumbling under the strain of constant harassment, the winter offering the rebellion both challenge and opportunity. The harsh conditions made movement difficult but also provided cover for their operations, the snow masking their tracks even as it numbed their fingers and froze their toes, the struggle for survival against the elements mirroring the larger conflict, both sides battling not just each other but the indifferent brutality of nature itself, the rebels adapting as they always had, their resilience born of necessity, their ingenuity sharpened by deprivation, the civilian population now openly aiding them in many areas, the tide of public opinion having turned decisively against the Lord whose name was spoken with increasing contempt, the once unassailable aura of his authority eroded by months of setbacks and miscalculations, the foundations of his rule cracking beneath the combined weight of military pressure and popular discontent, the endgame approaching with the inevitability of the changing seasons, the only question remaining not if the old order would fall but what would rise in its place, and whether the men who had fought to tear it down would prove any better at building something new, the ghosts of Eldamir watching silently from the shadows, the judgment reserved for the day when the last sword was sheathed and the true test began. Chapter 31. The frozen river cracked like a whip in the dead of night, the sound echoing across the rebel camp like a premonition of doom. Men jerked awake from their fitful sleep, hands scrambling for weapons before their eyes had fully adjusted to the moonlit darkness. Alaric stood motionless at the edge of the camp, his breath forming ghostly plumes in the air, his ears straining to separate natural ice fractures from approaching danger. The winter had become their silent ally and most brutal enemy simultaneously, freezing the Lord's soldiers in the garrisons while steeling rebel fingers and toes to blackened frostbite. A sentry materialized from the tree line, his face gaunt beneath a crust of frozen breath, reporting movement near the old mill road. Not soldiers, peasants, dozens of them, starving families dragging sledges piled with whatever they'd salvaged before the Lord's men burned their village. Alaric's jaw tightened as the first refugees stumbled into camp, their hollow eyes reflecting firelight like those of hunted animals. Children clutched at mothers whose ribs showed through threadbare shawls. An old man collapsed face first into the snow, his body too exhausted to shiver anymore. The rebellion had become a magnet for the dispossessed, its victories meaningless when measured against this endless river of human wreckage. The blacksmith appeared at Alaric's shoulder, his massive frame blocking the wind as they both surveyed this fresh hell. No words were needed. Every new mouth to feed stretched their meager supplies closer to breaking point. Every pair of frostbitten hands reaching for help was another chain binding them to a cause that grew heavier by the day. The miller's son turned revolutionary leader watched as his fighters, themselves half-starved, already moved to share their rations, their humanity not yet extinguished by war. This was the true battle, he realized. Not against the Lord's soldiers, but against the slow erosion of their own souls. The ice cracked again in the distance, a mocking reminder that nothing in this world held firm for long. Chapter 32. Dawn revealed the full horror in merciless detail. The refugees' skin stretched taut over protruding bones, their breath shallow and rattling. A woman no older than 20 cradled an infant that hadn't cried in days, its sunken fontanelle and blue-tinged lips telling a story more eloquent than any battlefield report. The rebel healer moved among them with dwindling supplies, her hands shaking not from cold but from the futility of treating starvation with handfuls of pine needle tea and stolen honey. Alaric stood apart, calculating numbers with a mind that had become more ledger than human. 37 new mouths, maybe 12 able-bodied enough to work, 4 already dying despite their efforts. The ruthless arithmetic of survival left no room for sentiment. They'd need to raid 3 times as many supply convoys just to stay level. His fingers absently traced the knife scar on his ribs, the old wound aching in the cold. The blacksmith approached, his usual booming voice reduced to a gravelly whisper. The Mill Road group weren't the only ones. Scouts say there's 2 more refugee bands heading our way from the southern valleys. The unspoken question hung between them like executioner's rope. Turn them away or collapse under the weight of their own compassion. Alaric's gaze fell on a child scraping frozen porridge from a dented tin, her tongue darting out to catch every precious crumb. The memory of another little girl, one he'd failed to save years before in Eldamere, flashed behind his eyes. He turned to the blacksmith, his voice stripped of all inflection. "Prepare the hunting parties. We'll need to go deeper into Loyalist territory." The decision was made. They would starve together or not at all. Around them, the camp stirred with the grim industry of people who'd long since forgotten what hope tasted like. Chapter 33. The raid was supposed to be simple. A lightly guarded granary on the edge of Loyalist lands. 3 days' march through snowdrifts that swallowed men up to their thighs. Alaric led 20 of their hardiest fighters, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they waded through the frozen hellscape. The cold played tricks on a man's mind, whispering voices in the wind, conjuring phantom lights in the distance. By the second night, young Thomas started screaming about fire wolves stalking him, his frostbitten fingers clawing at his own face until they had to tie him down. They left him wrapped in furs beneath a pine tree, promising to retrieve him on their return. The attack began at the false dawn, the granary guards sluggish with cold and complacency. Steel flashed in the pre-dawn gloom. 2 sentries died without a sound. Then the world exploded. The granary doors burst outward, revealing not the promised grain but a company of armored soldiers waiting in formation. The trap snapped shut with mechanical precision. Crossbow bolts tore through rebel ranks like hail. Alaric hit the frozen dirt as death whistled overhead. Around him, men fell with wet thuds, their blood steaming in the snow. The ambush had the practiced feel of betrayal. Someone had talked. The surviving rebels scattered like quail, the desperate flight punctuated by the twang of bowstrings. Alaric ran until his lungs burned, the shouts of pursuers growing fainter behind him. When he finally collapsed in a frozen creek bed, his body shaking with exhaustion and shock, the full weight of their predicament settled over him. They'd been outmaneuvered. The Lord wasn't just defending anymore, he was hunting. And he'd started by cutting off the rebellion's food supply. The ice beneath Alaric's cheek groaned ominously, a fitting soundtrack to the crumbling of all their carefully laid plans. Chapter 34. The survivors trickled back to camp over 3 agonizing days. Some missing fingers, one dragging a shattered leg, all hollow-eyed with the knowledge that they'd marched into a slaughterhouse. The blacksmith took one look at the decimated numbers and began barking orders to break camp. No time for grief. The soldiers would extract locations from wounded rebels. It was only a matter of time before the hammer fell. Alaric moved through the frantic activity like a sleepwalker, his mind replaying every decision that had led them here. The refugees, the desperate gamble, the dead eyes of Thomas as they'd left him beneath that pine tree. A hand gripped his arm, the healer, her face streaked with soot and something darker. "They're coming for the children," she whispered. "Not the Lord's men." Hunger. The realization hit him like a blow to the gut. In their rush to evacuate, the weakest would be left behind. The old, the wounded, the little girl who'd licked that tin clean yesterday. His vision swam with memories of another abandoned village, another time he'd turned away from suffering. The camp dissolved into chaos around him, oxen bellowing as they were hitched to carts, mothers bundling children into whatever would carry them, the acrid stench of fear cutting through the wood smoke. Somewhere in the madness, a decision formed in Alaric's fractured mind. Not again. Never again. He found the blacksmith directing traffic at the eastern trailhead. The words left his lips before he'd fully thought them through. Take them south to the marshes. I'll lead the soldiers north. The blacksmith's eyes widened. They both knew what that meant. A diversion. A suicide run. Alaric didn't wait for arguments. He was already moving toward the dwindling supply cache, his hands steady as he selected the fastest horse and the last of the black powder. The little girl watched him from beneath a moth-eaten blanket, her eyes too old for her face. He pressed his last piece of hardtack into her hand before swinging onto the saddle. The ice cracked one final time as he rode out, a fitting farewell for a man who'd run out of second chances. Chapter 35. The powder trail glittered in the moonlight like a serpent's scales. Alaric worked methodically, his numb fingers packing the last keg beneath the bridge's central support. Every explosion needed its stagecraft. This one would be a performance worthy of an audience. He'd left enough clues for even the dullest tracker to follow: snapped branches, a blood-stained bandage, the occasional footprint in softer snow. The Lord's men would come like hounds to the scent, their bloodlust overriding caution. The horse waited downstream, its breath pluming in the cold air. Good. Everything was ready. He crouched in the shadow of the bridge, the slow fuse coiled at his feet like a sleeping viper. Dawn tinged the horizon when the first helmet glinted through the trees. More followed, a full company at least, their armor rattling like dead men's bones. Alaric's lips peeled back in something too grim to be called a smile. The Lord himself rode, at the center, his fur-lined cloak a mockery of the starving wretches he'd created. Closer, just a little closer, the fuse hissed to life beneath his fingers, its spark racing toward destiny. The first horseman's mount stepped onto the bridge planking. Then everything was light and noise and splintering wood. The concussion knocked Alaric backward into the frozen creek, the world reduced to ringing silence and falling debris. Through the smoke, he saw the Lord's standard topple into the churning water. A cheer rose in his throat, then died as armored figures emerged from the smoke. Too many. The bridge had only claimed the vanguard. Now the real hunters remained. Alaric scrambled for the horse, crossbow bolts embedding in the ice where he'd lain seconds before. The animal screamed as one found its flank but ran anyway, its terror lending wings to its hooves. They crashed through the underbrush, death whistling past their ears. The forest blurred around them, the world narrowing to the drumbeat of pursuit and the hot blood streaming down the horse's leg. Somewhere ahead lay the gorge, unbridged since the rebels destroyed the last one. A final gambit, a last stand worth singing about, if anyone survived to sing. The horse's breathing turned ragged beneath him. The soldiers closed the gap, and Alaric, for the first time in years, felt something like peace settle over him. This was how it ended, not in a throne room or a bed, but here in the snow, fighting to his last breath. The gorge yawned before them, its depths hidden in morning mist. He kicked the wounded horse faster. Either they'd make the jump, or they wouldn't. The ice cracked one final time beneath their hooves as they launched into the void. Chapter 36. The impact of the frozen river knocked the breath from Alaric's lungs as he plunged through the thin ice, the shock of the water like 1,000 knives stabbing into his flesh simultaneously, the current grabbing at his legs with greedy fingers as he struggled to find purchase on the slippery rocks beneath, his sodden clothes dragging him down into the darkness as his muscles screamed with the effort of fighting both the river and the cold that was already leaching the strength from his limbs, his head breaking the surface just long enough to gasp a mouthful of air before being pulled under again, the world reduced to a blur of churning water and muffled shouts from the soldiers stranded on the bank, their crossbow bolts slicing harmlessly into the water around him as the current carried him swiftly downstream, the roar of blood in his ears drowning out all other sound as his body began to shut down from the cold, his vision tunneling to a pinprick of light that grew smaller with each passing second, the last coherent thought in his mind a grim satisfaction that at least he'd taken some of them with him before his luck finally ran out, the darkness closing in like an old friend as his limbs grew heavy and still, the current claiming him at last as his consciousness slipped away into the void. Chapter 37. The smell of burning herbs and the feel of rough wool against his bare skin were the first sensations to penetrate the fog of Alaric's returning consciousness, his body racked with uncontrollable shivering as warmth slowly seeped back into his frozen limbs, the taste of some bitter medicinal concoction still coating his tongue as his eyelids fluttered open to reveal a low ceiling of smoke-blackened thatch, the flickering light of a hearth fire casting dancing shadows across walls hung with drying plants and strange symbols carved into the wood, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and something more primal that set his teeth on edge, a shuffling movement to his left revealing a hunched figure stirring a bubbling pot over the fire, their face hidden beneath a hood of patchwork furs, the hands that lifted the ladle gnarled and spotted with age but moving with surprising precision, the voice that emerged from the shadows like the creaking of old trees in the wind telling him without turning that he'd been dead for 3 breaths when they pulled him from the river and that such things leave marks on a man's soul that never fully fade, the words settling over Alaric like a burial shroud as he tried unsuccessfully to sit up, his body refusing to obey his commands, the old one cackling at his efforts before shuffling closer to press a cup of steaming liquid to his cracked lips, the brew inside sending fire through his veins as it went down, his vision swimming with strange colors as the hut seemed to breathe around him, the shadows lengthening and twisting into shapes that almost resembled faces, the old one's whispered words about debts owed and prices yet to be paid, the last thing he heard before darkness claimed him once more. Chapter 38. The fever dreams lasted 7 days and nights, though Alaric only knew this because the old one told him so when he finally awoke clear-headed, his body weak as a newborn foal but free of the deathly chill that had nearly claimed him, the details of his delirium slipping away like water through fingers though the sense of dread they left behind remained, coiled like a serpent in his gut, the old crone watching him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to the rot in his soul as she wordlessly handed him a bowl of thin broth, the meager sustenance doing little to quiet the gnawing hunger in his belly but warming him from the inside nonetheless, the silence between them stretching until it became its own kind of conversation, the crackling of the fire and the occasional scuttling of unseen creatures in the rafters the only sounds in the cramped hut, the outside world existing only as muted sunlight filtering through the cracks in the walls, time itself seeming to hold its breath in this place that smelled of earth and old magic, Alaric's fingers tracing the fresh scars on his chest where the cold had bitten deepest as he contemplated the impossibility of his survival. The river should have been his grave, the soldiers his executioners, yet here he sat in this liminal space between life and death, his very breath a defiance of the natural order, the old one's sudden laughter like the cracking of ice on a frozen lake as she read his thoughts as easily as if he'd spoken them aloud, her gnarled finger pointing to a bundle of his dried clothes by the fire with a cryptic mutter about owing the river a life now and debts always coming due when least expected. Chapter 39. Strength returned to Alaric's limbs with agonizing slowness, each day bringing small improvements, the ability to sit up without assistance, to hold a spoon steady, to walk the few paces to the door and back without his legs buckling beneath him, but his body was a shadow of what it had been before the river, his muscles wasted from fever and starvation, the reflection that stared back at him from the still surface of the old one's water bucket that of a stranger with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much, the crone watching his progress with a mixture of amusement and something darker as she went about her inscrutable routines of gathering herbs and muttering to spirits only she could see, the forest outside the hut teeming with a life that seemed to pause whenever Alaric stepped across the threshold, the birds falling silent, the wind stilling as if the very woods were holding their breath in anticipation of something yet to come, the old one's warnings about venturing too far falling on deaf ears as Alaric's restlessness grew with each passing day, the need to know what had become of his rebels and the refugees a constant itch between his shoulder blades, the 4th morning since his awakening dawning with a clarity that cut through the usual mist surrounding the hut, the old one absent from her usual place by the fire, Alaric seizing the opportunity to dress in his patched and mended clothes, the fabric hanging loose on his diminished frame, the knife she'd left beside his sleeping pallet the only farewell he'd likely receive as he pushed open the door and stepped into the weak winter sunlight, the forest exhaling around him as he took his first unassisted steps toward whatever fate awaited him beyond the trees. Chapter 40. The world beyond the old one's forest was a graveyard of Alaric's hopes. The first village he stumbled upon reduced to blackened timbers and scattered bones, the Lord's crest carved into the foreheads of those left hanging from the blasted oak at the settlement's center, the message clear even if the specifics were lost to him, his stomach turning at the sight of small skeletons among the ruins, the rebellion's failure written in the ashes and the absolute silence that hung over the killing ground. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of the wind through empty doorframes. His journey southward revealed similar scenes at every turn, the land scoured clean of life where once there had been thriving communities. The few survivors he encountered either too broken to speak or too terrified to do more than cross themselves and hurry away at the sight of him. The rumors he pieced together from whispered fragments painting a picture of total defeat, the blacksmith captured and broken on the wheel, the healer burned as a witch, the refugees scattered to the four winds or worse, the Lord's vengeance complete and merciless, the rebellion not just crushed but erased from history as thoroughly as if it had never been, Alaric's name mentioned only as a cautionary tale about the fate of traitors, his supposed death at the gorge celebrated throughout the county with bonfires and feasting, the world moving on without him as he wandered like a ghost through the ruins of everything he'd fought for, his knife growing heavier in his belt with each passing day as the full weight of his failure settled over him, the old one's words about debts coming due echoing in his skull as he stood one evening on the outskirts of what had once been Eldamere, the circle now complete, his journey ending where it had begun in the ashes of his childhood home, the irony of it almost beautiful in its cruelty as he sank to his knees in the snow and finally allowed the tears to come. Chapter 41. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets over the ruins of Eldamere, burying the bones and blackened timbers beneath a pristine white shroud as if nature itself sought to erase the evidence of what had happened there. Alaric knelt in the center of the village square where the bodies of his family had once been displayed, his hands digging through the snow until his fingers found the frozen earth beneath, the cold biting into his skin with teeth sharper than any blade. Time had lost all meaning since his return. Days blended together in an unbroken procession of numbness and exhaustion, his body moving through the motions of survival without conscious thought, his mind trapped in a loop of memories and regrets that played endlessly behind his eyes. The old mill still stood at the edge of the village, its great wheel frozen solid in the icy stream, the building itself little more than a hollow shell of what it had once been, the Lord's men having taken special care to destroy every last symbol of the rebellion's origins. He found himself drawn to the ruins each morning, picking through the debris. Like a man searching for answers in the wreckage of his own life, the weight of his failures pressing down on him with each step. The cold had seeped into his bones during his time in the river, a chill that no fire could seem to touch, his hands trembling even when clenched into fists, his breath coming in ragged gasps that hung in the air like ghosts. At night he slept fitfully in the remains of his family's cottage, the roof half collapsed but still offering some shelter from the elements, his dreams filled with images of the dead, his parents, his comrades, the refugees he'd tried and failed to protect, their accusing stares following him even in sleep, their silent judgments more painful than any physical wound. Chapter 42. The first visitor came on the seventh day, a huntsman from the nearby woods who froze in his tracks when he spotted Alaric moving through the ruins, his face going pale beneath his beard as he crossed himself and backed away slowly. Word spread quickly after that, carried by traders and travelers along the frozen roads, whispers of a ghost haunting Eldamere's ruins, a spirit returned from the grave to seek vengeance on the living. By the time the second visitor arrived, a grizzled old farmer bearing offerings of bread and salt, Alaric had ceased to care whether he was seen or not, his existence reduced to the simple rhythm of survival, his days spent foraging for what little food could be found in the dead of winter, his nights spent staring into the meager fire as the wind howled through the broken walls. The farmer left his gifts at the edge of the village and fled without speaking, but others soon followed, their fear giving way to cautious curiosity as the days passed and the ghost in the ruins made no move to harm them. They came bearing food, clothing, even weapons, small offerings left in the snow like sacrifices to some vengeful god, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe as they caught glimpses of the gaunt figure moving through the wreckage of his former life. Alaric accepted the gifts without comment, his silence only adding to the legend growing around him, the people of the countryside weaving their own stories about the man who had cheated death twice over, the rebel leader who had returned from the grave to walk among them once more. Chapter 43. The dreams grew worse as winter dragged on, the line between waking and sleeping blurring until Alaric could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The dead spoke to him in the flickering firelight, their voices rising from the shadows to whisper secrets he didn't want to hear, their words slipping through his fingers like smoke when he tried to grasp them. The old one's hut appeared to him in flashes, the smell of burning herbs, the feel of rough wool against his skin, but the memories dissolved like mist whenever he reached for them, leaving behind only a sense of unease that clung to him like a second skin. He took to wandering the frozen countryside at night, his bare feet leaving no prints in the snow as he moved like a spectre through the sleeping villages, peering into windows at families gathered around their hearths, their faces illuminated by firelight, their laughter drifting through the cracks in the shutters. They looked like ghosts to him, pale imitations of life, their happiness fragile and fleeting, and he found himself envying their ignorance even as he despised them for it. The Lord's tax collectors still made their rounds despite the season, their heavy cloaks lined with fur, their belts jingling with coins extracted from people who could scarcely afford to feed themselves. Alaric watched them from the shadows, his fingers itching for the knife at his belt, but something held him back, not fear, but a strange sort of detachment, as if he were observing the world from some great height, his own emotions muted and distant. Chapter 44. The thaw came early that year, the snow melting away to reveal the blackened earth beneath, the stench of death rising from the ground as the frozen corpses of winter began to rot in the sudden warmth. Alaric woke one morning to find the ruins of Eldamere crawling with carrion birds, their ragged wings blotting out the sun as they fought over scraps of flesh still clinging to the bones scattered throughout the village. He drove them off with shouts and thrown stones, his voice hoarse from disuse, his movements sluggish with hunger and exhaustion. The stream by the mill broke free of its icy prison with a sound like cracking bones, the water rushing over the frozen wheel with a force that set it groaning into motion for the first time in years, the sound echoing through the empty village like the ghost of industry long dead. That same afternoon, a group of villagers arrived bearing shovels and picks, their faces set in grim determination as they set to work digging graves for the remains littering the ground. They worked in silence, casting occasional glances at Alaric where he sat watching from the steps of the ruined mill, their fear of him warring with some deeper need to honor the dead. By nightfall, the last of the bones had been laid to rest in a mass grave at the edge of the village, the earth packed down over them with the solemn finality of a door slamming shut. The villagers left without speaking to him, their torches flickering in the gathering darkness as they made their way back to their homes, their shadows stretching long behind them. Alaric remained where he was, staring at the freshly turned earth as the first stars appeared overhead, the weight of all those lives pressing down on him until he could scarcely breathe. Chapter 45. Spring arrived in fits and starts, a week of warm rain that turned the roads to rivers of mud, followed by sudden frosts that left the fields glittering with ice each morning. The first green shoots pushed their way through the charred remains of Eldamere, their vibrant hue a stark contrast to the blackened earth around them. Alaric watched them grow with something approaching fascination, his fingers tracing their progress each day as they stretched toward the sun. The villagers continued to visit, their fear of him gradually giving way to a wary sort of reverence, their offerings now accompanied by quiet words of thanks or muttered prayers. They spoke to him of the Lord's increasing cruelty, of taxes raised yet again despite the starving winter, of sons and daughters taken for some new project in the capital, their voices trembling with suppressed rage. Alaric listened but did not respond, his silence more telling than any words could have been. The dreams still came most nights, but they had changed, no longer visions of the past, but of a future yet to unfold, images of fire and blood and a great reckoning that would sweep the land clean of its oppressors. He woke from these dreams with his heart pounding and the taste of smoke on his tongue, the certainty that something was coming settling over him like a second skin. The old one's words about debts and prices echoed in his mind with increasing frequency, their meaning becoming clearer with each passing day. The Lord might have won the battle, but the war was far from over, and Alaric had been spared for a reason. The first buds of spring were just beginning to open on the trees when he finally rose from his place among the ruins and set off down the road toward the capital, his knife sharp at his belt, his eyes fixed on the horizon where dark clouds were gathering. Behind him, the wind whispered through the empty streets of Eldamir, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. Chapter 46. The road to the capital stretched like a scar across the land, cutting through fields still brown from winter and villages that seemed to shrink in on themselves as Alaric passed. He walked with the hood of his threadbare cloak pulled low, his face hidden in shadow, his steps measured and silent. The few travelers he encountered gave him a wide berth, their instincts warning him of the danger that clung to him like a second skin. The Lord's soldiers were everywhere, their patrols more frequent since the rebellion's end, their eyes sharp for any sign of dissent. Alaric avoided them with ease, melting into the trees at the first clink of armor or rumble of hoofbeats. The land grew richer as he neared the capital, the villages larger, the fields better tended, but the fear in people's eyes was the same. He saw it in the way mothers pulled their children indoors at the sight of a stranger, in the way men averted the gazes when soldiers passed, in the way the elderly whispered behind raised hands. The Lord's influence was a poison that had seeped into every corner of the kingdom, its effects visible even here, where the houses were sturdy and the storehouses full. The capital itself rose suddenly from the horizon, its high stone walls gleaming in the afternoon sun, the banners of the Lord's house fluttering arrogantly from every tower. Alaric paused at the edge of the tree line, taking in the sight of the city that had birthed so much suffering, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. The gates stood open, but the guards were thorough, questioning every entrant, searching carts and bundles with practiced efficiency. He waited until dusk, when the flow of traffic increased as farmers returned from market and laborers made their way home, slipping through the gates in the shadow of a merchant's wagon, his heart pounding with the thrill of the hunt. Chapter 47. The stench of the capital hit him like a physical blow, a thick miasma of sewage and smoke and too many bodies pressed too close together. The streets were a maze of narrow alleys and crowded thoroughfares, the buildings leaning precariously over the cobbles as if trying to eavesdrop on the conversations below. Alaric moved through the chaos with the ease of a ghost, his years in the wilds having honed his ability to disappear in plain sight. The people here were different from those in the countryside, louder, brasher, their faces set in permanent scowls or false smiles, their eyes sharp with calculation. He saw beggars with missing limbs and merchants with rings on every finger, street children darting through the crowds with practiced stealth, and guards lounging in doorways, their expressions bored but their hands never far from their weapons. The disparity between rich and poor was staggering, the excesses of the nobility on grotesque display beside the grinding poverty of the lower districts. He found a room in a ramshackle inn near the docks, paying with coins from the village's offerings, the innkeeper too drunk to look at him closely. The room was little more than a closet with a straw pallet, but it was dry and, more importantly, private. From his tiny window, he could see the Lord's palace looming over the city, its towers piercing the sky like daggers, its walls impenetrable. Laughter and music floated down from its open windows, the sounds of revelry a stark contrast to the quiet desperation of the streets below. Alaric lay on the pallet and stared at the water-stained ceiling, his mind working through the problem before him. The Lord thought himself untouchable, safe behind his walls and guards. He would learn otherwise. Chapter 48. The next days were spent in careful observation, Alaric moving through the city like a shadow, learning its rhythms and secrets. He haunted the taverns where off-duty guards drank, listening to their boasts and complaints, piecing together the palace's routines. He lingered in the market squares where servants gossiped while shopping, noting who was trusted and who was not. He walked the perimeter of the palace walls at all hours, marking the guard changes, the weak points, the hidden corners where the shadows lay thickest. The palace was a fortress, but no fortress was impregnable. Every structure had its flaws, every system its vulnerabilities. He learned of the Lord's habits, his love of hunting, his weekly visits to the temple, his fondness for a particular brothel in the silk district. He learned of the household staff, which cooks could be bribed, which guards were lax in the duties, which servants might be sympathetic to the rebellion's cause. Most importantly, he learned of the Lord's new project, a grand monument to his victory over the rebels, built with forced labor and funded by the increased taxes. The workers were housed in a compound near the palace, their conditions brutal, their mortality rate high. Alaric felt the old anger stirring in his chest as he watched them shuffle to and from the site, their faces hollow, their backs bent under the weight of their chains. They were the reason he was here, the reason he had survived when so many others had not. The Lord would pay for what he had done, not just to Eldamere, but to all the villages like it, to all the people who had dared to hope for something better. The time for hiding was over. Chapter 49. The plan came together slowly, piece by piece, each detail meticulously considered. Alaric spent his nights sketching maps on scraps of parchment, memorizing guard rotations, rehearsing every possible scenario in his mind. He visited the workers' compound under cover of darkness, speaking to them through the fences, his words a spark in the tinder of their rage. Not all were willing to listen, some were too broken, too afraid, but others leaned closer, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight, their whispers fierce with promise. In the taverns, he sought out those who had lost family to the rebellion's suppression, the grief a weapon waiting to be wielded. Among the servants, he found those who resented their masters, their bitterness a tool to be exploited. The pieces were there, scattered across the city like shards of glass. All he had to do was gather them up and arrange them into something sharp enough to draw blood. The date was set for the night of the summer festival, when the palace would be distracted by celebrations and the city drunk on cheap wine. The Lord would be at his most vulnerable, surrounded by sycophants and hangers-on, his guard lowered by arrogance and alcohol. Alaric sharpened his knife each night, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a meditation, a promise. The old one's words echoed in his mind, debts come due. The Lord had built his kingdom on the backs of the broken and the dead. It was time he learned the price of such an economy. Chapter 50. The day of the festival dawned bright and hot, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and spilled ale. The streets were packed with revelers, their faces flushed with drink and dancing, their voices raised in raucous song. Alaric moved among them like a wraith, his hood drawn up despite the heat, his eyes scanning the crowd for the faces of his allies. They were in position, workers with makeshift weapons hidden beneath their ragged clothes, servants with keys pilfered from their masters' belts, guards whose loyalties had been bought or coerced. The plan was simple, chaos as distraction, confusion as weapon. A series of carefully timed incidents would draw the palace guards away from their posts, leaving the Lord exposed. Alaric would handle the rest. As dusk fell and the festival reached its peak, the first signal came, a fire in the silk district, its flames leaping high into the night sky, the screams of the crowd carrying all the way to the palace gates. The guards hesitated, then streamed toward the blaze, the discipline crumbling in the face of panic. The second signal followed moments later, a riot at the workers' compound, the sound of shattering chains and raised voices echoing through the streets. More guards rushed to quell the disturbance, their numbers thinning by the minute. Alaric slipped through the chaos like a knife through silk, his movements precise, his focus absolute. The servants' entrance was unguarded, the door left ajar by a sympathetic kitchen maid. The corridors beyond were dimly lit, the sounds of the festival muffled by thick tapestries and richer laughter. He followed the map in his mind, each turn, each stairway leading him closer to his goal. The Lord was in his private chambers, according to the gossiping servants, celebrating his victories with his inner circle, drunk on wine and his own invincibility. Alaric's fingers tightened around the knife at his belt as he reached the final hallway, the door to the Lord's chambers just visible at the end. Two guards stood watch, their postures relaxed, their attention divided between the duty and the sounds of revelry below. They never saw him coming. Chapter 51. The first guard died with Alaric's knife between his ribs, the blade slipping through the gap in his armor with the ease of a serpent sliding into water. The second turned just in time to see his companion crumple, his mouth opening to shout a warning that never came. Alaric's hand clamped over his lips as the knife found his throat, the hot rush of blood coating both their hands as the life left his eyes. He lowered the body to the floor without a sound, his ears straining for any indication that the struggle had been heard over the din of celebration from the chambers beyond. The door was heavy oak banded with iron, but the latch lifted without resistance, the Lord's arrogance extending even to his personal security. Alaric pushed it open just enough to slip through, the scene inside freezing him mid-step. The Lord reclined on a dais at the room's center, his gilded chair more throne than furniture, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he watched the entertainment before him. A group of chained rebels, survivors of the purges, kneeled in broken lines, their faces battered but defiant as a line of nobles took turns spitting on them. Wine flowed freely, laughter ringing off the vaulted ceilings, the air thick with the cloying scent of perfumes meant to mask the stench of human misery. Alaric's vision tunneled, his grip on the knife turning his knuckles white. Every face in that room had been at Eldamere. Every jewel-adorned hand had signed the orders that burned villages and slaughtered children. The old rage surged through him, hotter than the fever that had nearly claimed him in the river, more potent than the black powder that had shattered the bridge. He stepped fully into the room and let the door slam shut behind him. Chapter 52. The revelry died instantly, a dozen heads swiveling toward the interruption. The Lord's smirk faltered as he took in Alaric's scarred face, the recognition dawning slowly. This wasn't a servant, wasn't some drunken noble strayed from the festivities. The rebels on the floor gasped, one whispering his name like a prayer. Alaric didn't speak. He didn't need to. The knife in his hand said everything required. Chaos erupted. Nobles scrambled backward, knocking over tables and each other in their panic. The Lord bellowed for guards who would not come. Alaric moved with the terrible efficiency of a man who had nothing left to lose, his blade finding its first target, a fat magistrate who had once ordered a village flogged for failing to meet quotas. The man squealed like a pig as the steel opened his belly, his silks turning crimson as he collapsed. The others screamed, their fine manners forgotten as they clawed toward the room's other exits, but Alaric had barred those himself before entering. This was a reckoning long overdue. The Lord had drawn a jeweled dagger from his belt, his face purple with rage. "You're supposed to be dead." Alaric wiped his blade clean on a fallen noble's cloak. "I got better." Chapter 53. What followed was not a fight but a slaughter. The Lord was soft from years of luxury, his reflexes dulled by wine and unquestioned power. His dagger thrust was clumsy, easily sidestepped as Alaric's knife opened his forearm to the bone. The Lord howled, clutching the wound as blood sheeted down his embroidered sleeve. Around them, the remaining nobles cowered, their finery splattered with the gore of their companions. The rebels watched in stunned silence as Alaric drove the Lord backward with methodical strikes, a slash across the thigh, a stab to the shoulder, each wound carefully calculated to maim but not kill. Not yet. The Lord stumbled over a fallen goblet, crashing onto his back atop the dais. Alaric pinned him with a boot to the chest, the knife hovering above his left eye. "You took everything from me." The Lord spat blood. "You peasants never learn. Kill me, another just like me will take my place." Alaric leaned closer. "Then we'll kill them too." The knife came down. Chapter 54. Dawn found the capital in flames. The Lord's head adorned a pike outside the palace gates, his expression frozen in permanent surprise. The workers had risen en masse, their chains shattered, their rage unleashed upon the symbols of their oppression. The nobles who hadn't fled were dragged screaming into the streets, their finery torn to rags as the city devoured its masters. Alaric stood atop the palace walls, watching the smoke rise from a dozen districts. The rebellion had been reborn in blood and fire, its heart beating anew in the chest of every commoner who picked up a weapon. Below, a crowd gathered, their faces upturned, their voices rising in a wordless cry of triumph and vengeance. The blacksmith's daughter, now a hardened warrior in her own right, climbed to stand beside him. What now? Alaric watched the flames dance in her eyes. Now we build something better. The wind carried the ashes of the old world away as the new one began. Chapter 55. The streets ran red with the blood of nobles and loyalists as the rebellion surged through the capital like a wildfire, the people's pent-up fury unleashed after years of oppression. Alaric moved through the chaos with single-minded purpose, his knife never resting as he sought out the remaining architects of Eldamir's destruction. The palace became the epicenter of the uprising, its gilded halls now home to the ragged and the vengeful, the rebels turning the seat of their oppression into the heart of their revolution. The lord's inner circle met their ends in the very chambers where they'd plotted the rebellion's destruction, their screams blending with the cacophony of a city tearing itself free from tyranny. By midday, the capital's gates had been thrown open to the countryside, word spreading like lightning that the impossible had happened, the lord was dead, his regime crumbling before the people's wrath. Villagers streamed into the city, bearing weapons and fresh hatred, their faces alight with the fervor of those who see vengeance within reach. The remaining loyalist forces either fled or switched allegiances with the pragmatism of men who valued survival over honor. Alaric found himself at the center of a storm he'd set in motion but could no longer control, the rebellion taking on a life of its own as it spread beyond the capital's walls. The blacksmith's daughter organized the rebels with terrifying efficiency, her voice cutting through the bedlam as she directed the seizure of armories and granaries. The workers from the monument site became an impromptu militia, their intimate knowledge of the city's layout proving invaluable as they rooted out hidden loyalists. The air grew thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood, the capital's once pristine streets transformed into a battleground where the oppressed became the oppressors, the cycle of violence spinning faster with each passing hour. Chapter 56. The first signs of backlash emerged as the initial euphoria of victory faded into the hard reality of governance. Without the lord's iron grip, old rivalries between villages and trade guilds resurfaced, the fragile unity of the rebellion fracturing along lines of self-interest. The capital's merchants, initially supportive when it meant overthrowing the nobility, balked at the rebels' redistribution policies. Food shortages began as supply routes were disrupted, the very people who had cheered the lord's fall now grumbling about empty bellies. Alaric moved through these growing tensions like a ghost, his wounds from the palace fight still fresh but ignored, his focus now on preventing the revolution from consuming itself. The blacksmith's daughter proved a natural leader, her pragmatic approach to justice winning over skeptics, but even she couldn't stop the sporadic violence erupting across the city. In the countryside, rumors spread of warlords filling the power vacuum, their bands of armed men preying on vulnerable villages under the banner of revolutionary justice. The old one's words about debts and prices echoed in Alaric's mind as he surveyed the unintended consequences of his vengeance. The lord was gone, but the systems of oppression had merely taken new forms. The rebellion's ideals of equality and justice were being twisted by those seeking personal gain, the noble's severed head having created a hydra of new problems. The first executions of corrupt rebels took place in the palace square, the blacksmith's daughter wielding the axe herself to demonstrate that the new order would tolerate no repeat of the old abuses. Alaric watched from the shadows, the weight of leadership settling on shoulders still bruised from battle. The true fight, he realized, wasn't against a single tyrant but against the eternal human capacity for cruelty. The revolution had won its war, now came the harder task of winning the peace. Chapter 57. The dreams returned with a vengeance as the weeks passed, the faces of the dead crowding Alaric's sleep with accusatory stares. He took to wandering the capital's rooftops at night, the city spread out beneath him like a living thing, its wounds slowly healing under the rebels' rough administration. The blacksmith's daughter had organized a council of representatives from each district, their meetings chaotic but earnest attempts at self-governance. The monument to the Lord's victory was being dismantled stone by stone, the workers who had built it now taking it apart with grim satisfaction. Alaric kept to the edges of this new order, his role as executioner of the old regime making him both revered and feared in equal measure. The few surviving nobles had been imprisoned rather than killed, their fates to be decided by the people they'd oppressed, a mercy they'd never granted their own enemies. The first harvest since the revolution began trickling into the city, easing the food shortages and buying the new government precious time to establish itself. Rumors reached the capital of neighboring lords marshalling forces to crush the rebellion before its ideas could spread, their armies gathering at the borders like storm clouds. The blacksmith's daughter prepared defenses with the same practicality she'd shown in battle, conscripting former soldiers and training volunteers in the basics of warfare. Alaric found himself drawn to these training yards, his combat experience making him an unlikely but effective instructor. The young men and women who came to learn stared at him with something approaching awe, their eyes wide at the legends already growing around the man who'd killed the Lord. He showed them how to hold a sword, how to exploit an opponent's weakness, how to kill without hesitation, skills he prayed they'd never need to use. The world outside the capital remained unstable, the revolution's hold on power tenuous at best. The old systems of authority had been shattered, but nothing solid had yet taken the place. Alaric sensed the fragility of their victory like a hairline crack in glass, the entire structure one sharp blow away from collapse. The debts of the past had been paid in blood, now came the harder work of building something that wouldn't require future generations to do the same. Chapter 58. The first attack came at dawn, a contingent of a neighboring lord's forces testing the capital's defenses with a raid on the western gate. The rebels repelled them with minimal losses, but the message was clear: the revolution would not be allowed to stand. Alaric stood on the battlements afterward, watching the retreating forces vanish into the morning mist, his fingers tracing the fresh notch in his blade. The blacksmith's daughter joined him, her armor still streaked with blood, her expression grim. They'd known this was coming, but the reality of open war settled over them both like a physical weight. The council convened an emergency session that lasted well into the night, the debates ranging from surrender to preemptive strikes against neighboring territories. Alaric listened in silence as the arguments swirled around him, recognizing in each speaker the same mix of fear and determination that had fueled his own journey from miller's son to revolutionary. The decision was made to fortify the capital and send envoys to nearby villages, hoping to rally the countryside against the encroaching threat. The next weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Walls were reinforced, stores laid in, weapons distributed to every able-bodied citizen. The capital transformed into an armed camp, its streets bristling with defensive works, its people moving with the purposeful energy of those fighting for their survival. Alaric found himself thrust into a leadership role he'd never sought, his battlefield experience making him a natural commander despite his reluctance. The blacksmith's daughter handled the political aspects with surprising skill, her blunt honesty winning over skeptics and her unwavering commitment to the revolution's ideals keeping the more extreme elements in check. The first major assault came on a rain-soaked night, the enemy forces breaching the outer defenses before being driven back in a brutal street-by-street battle that left hundreds dead on both sides. Alaric fought like a man possessed, his blade cutting through the enemy ranks with terrifying efficiency, his reputation growing with each life he took. When dawn finally broke over the battered city, the enemy was in retreat, but the cost had been high, the streets ran red. Again, this time with the blood of defenders as well as attackers. The revolution had survived its first real test, but the war was only beginning. Chapter 59. The seasons turned as the conflict dragged on, the capital becoming an island of rebellion in a sea of hostile territories. The surrounding countryside became a no-man's land of skirmishes and raids, the front lines shifting daily as both sides probed for weaknesses. Alaric's hair grew long and streaked with grey, his body accumulating scars like a map of the war's progression. The blacksmith's daughter proved as capable a wartime leader as she had been a revolutionary, her decisions keeping the city fed and defended despite the siege conditions. The council meetings grew shorter and more pragmatic as survival took precedence over ideology. The dream of a just society deferred in favor of the immediate need to not be slaughtered. The enemy lords, initially divided by their own rivalries, had formed an uneasy alliance to crush the rebellion, the combined forces pressing ever closer to the capital's walls. Alaric led sorties beyond the defenses whenever possible, striking at supply lines and gathering intelligence, his knowledge of guerrilla warfare proving invaluable against the more traditional tactics of their foes. The dreams continued to plague him, the faces of the dead now joined by those he killed since the revolution began, enemy soldiers, corrupt rebels, innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. He stopped sleeping altogether for a time, pushing himself to the brink of collapse before the blacksmith's daughter forcibly restrained him to a bed for 2 full days. The war ground on with no end in sight, both sides locked in a bloody stalemate that drained resources and lives with equal abandon. The capital's once vibrant streets grew somber as the reality of prolonged conflict set in, the initial revolutionary fervor giving way to grim determination. Alaric found himself staring at maps for hours at a stretch, searching for some solution that wouldn't result in the annihilation of everything they'd built. The answer, when it came, arrived not from strategy but from desperation, a messenger from the northern reaches, bearing word of a new threat that might either doom them all or provide the revolution's salvation. The enemy lords were mustering their full strength for a final assault on the capital, but their own borders were now threatened by a foreign invasion from across the mountains. The war was about to become much larger, and the revolution's survival might depend on choosing the right side in a conflict they hadn't even known was coming. Chapter 60. The messenger's words hung in the council chamber like smoke, the implications settling over the assembled rebels with the weight of an executioner's axe. A foreign army was massing beyond the northern mountains, their advanced scouts already skirmishing with the outlying villages of the very lords besieging the capital. Alaric studied the messenger's face, a grizzled woodsman with eyes that had seen too much, searching for any hint of deception, but found only the same exhausted determination that marked all survivors of this endless war. The blacksmith's daughter broke the silence first, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "We send envoys to the lords. Offer an alliance against this new threat." The chamber erupted in protest, rebels shouting about betrayal and vengeance, but Alaric understood the brutal pragmatism of her suggestion. The enemy of my enemy was still my enemy, but a temporary ceasefire might buy the revolution time to regroup. He stood, the scrape of his chair silencing the room, and spoke for the first time since the messenger's arrival. "We don't have to love them. Just survive them." The vote was close, but passed. They would attempt to parley with the lords who had slaughtered the comrades, because the alternative was annihilation. That night, Alaric climbed to the highest remaining tower of the palace, his body aching from months of near-constant fighting, and watched the distant glow of enemy campfires encircling the city like a necklace of fallen stars. Somewhere beyond those mountains, an entirely new army gathered, their motives unknown, their strength untested. The revolution had survived betrayal, siege, and internal strife, but this new threat might be the one that finally broke them. The wind carried the scent of rain and distant burning, the premonition of change stirring the hairs on his neck. The lords would either see reason or they wouldn't. Either way, the next move would decide everything. Chapter 61. The parley took place in the blasted no-man's land between the capital's outer defenses and the nearest enemy encampment, a scorched field where nothing grew but the occasional skeletal tree. Alaric went with the blacksmith's daughter and 2 council members, their party small enough to show they weren't threatening but large enough to suggest they could defend themselves if needed. The lords sent a delegation of armored knights and 1 graying commander whose missing eye and scarred face spoke of a lifetime spent at war. They met beneath the makeshift awning, the summer sun beating down mercilessly, the tension so thick it seemed to warp the air itself. The blacksmith's daughter laid out the proposal with the same blunt honesty that had served her so well, a temporary truce to face the greater threat, after which they could resume trying to kill each other. The commander listened in silence, his single eye flickering between the rebels, lingering longest on Alaric. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravel worn smooth by years of shouting orders. "You're asking us to trust the people who murdered our liege lord in his own chambers." Alaric met that piercing gaze without flinching. "We're asking you not to die for pride when there's a real enemy coming." The silence stretched, both sides weighing the unthinkable against the inevitable. Finally, the commander spat in the dust at their feet, not quite agreement, but not outright refusal either. "We'll take your proposal to the Council of Lords. Don't expect gratitude if they accept." As the enemy delegation rode away, the blacksmith's daughter exhaled sharply. "That went better than I expected." Alaric watched the retreating figures, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The true test wouldn't be getting the lords to agree, it would be convincing his own people to fight alongside their former oppressors. The revolution had been built on hatred of the nobility. Asking rebels to now stand with them would fracture whatever unity remained. But survival had a way of focusing the mind, and the alternative was watching everything they'd built be crushed beneath a foreign boot. The walk back to the city gates was silent, each lost in their own thoughts about what fresh hell they'd just invited. Chapter 62 News of the potential alliance spread through the capital like wildfire, sparking riots in some districts and quiet resignation in others. The council chamber became a battleground of shouted arguments and near-violent disagreements, the revolution's fragile coalition threatening to shatter under the strain. Alaric watched from the shadows as usual, letting the blacksmith's daughter handle the political maneuvering while he prepared for the more immediate threat. If the lords agreed to the truce, the combined forces would need to march north within days to have any hope of intercepting the foreign army before it reached populated areas. The training yards worked double shifts, turning shopkeepers and farmers into something resembling soldiers, their faces set in grim determination as they drilled with whatever weapons could be scavenged. The enemy's response came 3 days later, delivered by the same one-eyed commander under flag of truce. The lords would agree to the alliance, with conditions. The revolution must acknowledge their authority once the foreign threat was neutralized, and Alaric himself would be surrendered for trial regarding the lord's murder. The blacksmith's daughter laughed in the commander's face. "We'll keep fighting you and the foreigners then." The negotiations continued through the night, the terms being adjusted with each passing hour. No surrender of revolutionaries, but a general amnesty for both sides once the war was over. No restoration of the old feudal system, but elections to determine the new government. By dawn, they had something resembling an agreement, though neither side was happy with it, the mark of a true compromise. As the commander rode away to prepare his forces, Alaric turned to the blacksmith's daughter. "They'll betray us the moment the foreigners are dealt with." She nodded, her expression grim. "And we'll betray them first if we have to." The unspoken truth hung between them. This alliance was a temporary convenience, nothing more. But for now, it gave them a fighting chance. The orders went out to prepare for march, the capital emptying of its defenders as the combined rebel and loyalist forces moved north toward the mountains, a strange procession of former enemies now marching under hastily designed banners that bore neither lord's crest nor revolutionary symbol, but simply the image of the shared homeland. Alaric walked among them, his presence causing uneasy whispers from both sides. The man who had killed a lord now fighting beside lords, the revolutionary who had become exactly what he'd once rebelled against. The dreams continued, more vivid than ever, the faces of the dead now joined by those not yet fallen. The road ahead would be bloody, but then, when had it ever been otherwise? Chapter 63 The mountains rose before them like the jagged teeth of some primordial beast, their snow-capped peaks glinting in the summer sun. Scouts reported the foreign army had already begun its descent through the high passes, their numbers greater than anticipated, their armor strange and their weapons unfamiliar. The combined rebel-loyalist force made camp in the foothills, the tension between the two groups simmering just below the surface as they prepared the defenses. Alaric found himself studying the loyalist troops with grudging respect. Whatever their political faults, these were professional soldiers who knew their business, their fortifications well placed and the discipline impressive. The blacksmith's daughter moved between both camps with surprising ease, her no-nonsense attitude transcending old hatreds as she coordinated the combined efforts. The first skirmishes came at dusk, foreign scouts probing their lines with lightning-fast raids before vanishing back into the gathering darkness. Their fighting style was unlike anything Alaric had encountered, fluid formations that seemed to melt and reform like quicksilver, their arrows fletched with feathers of unnatural blue, their war cries echoing strangely in the mountain air. Prisoners revealed nothing, their language incomprehensible, their eyes burning with fanatical devotion to some unseen master. The night before the expected full assault, Alaric climbed to a high ridge overlooking the enemy camp, their fires stretching as far as the eye could see, an army larger than any he'd ever faced, their purpose still unclear. The one-eyed commander joined him unexpectedly. The two enemies turned allies standing in silence as they contemplated the force arrayed against them. "Whatever happens tomorrow," the commander said at last, "it's been an honor fighting beside you, rebel." Alaric snorted. "Don't get sentimental. We still might have to kill each other next week." But as he looked down at the sea of enemy fires, he understood the truth. Win or lose, nothing would be the same after this battle. The revolution, the lords, their entire way of life might be swept away by whatever was coming down from those mountains. The wind carried the scent of snow and something darker, a hint of metal and decay that set his teeth on edge. Tomorrow would decide everything. He touched the knife at his belt out of habit, the cool metal a reassurance in a world gone mad. The dreams that night were worse than ever, the faces of the dead now screaming warnings he couldn't understand. Chapter 64. Dawn broke over a battlefield already in motion, the foreign army advancing with eerie synchronization, their polished armor catching the first light in blinding flashes. Alaric stood with the rebel contingent on the left flank, his eyes scanning the approaching forces for any weakness to exploit. The loyalist troops held the center, the disciplined ranks a stark contrast to the more fluid rebel formations, while a mixed cavalry unit waited in reserve. The battle began not with a charge, but with a sound, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in the bones more than the ears. The foreign troops moved in perfect harmony with it, their advance suddenly accelerating with unnatural speed. The first clash was brutal, the rebels holding the ground through sheer determination as the enemy's strange weapons sliced through armor like parchment. Alaric fought with the cold efficiency that had made him legend, his blade finding gaps in the foreign armor, his movements economical and precise. But for every enemy he cut down, two more seemed to take their place, the tide of battle slowly turning against them. The loyalist center was buckling under the onslaught, the disciplined formations proving inadequate against an enemy that fought without regard for conventional tactics. The one-eyed commander went down, his banner falling into the mud as foreign troops swarmed over his position. Just when all seemed lost, the blacksmith's daughter led a desperate counterattack from the reserves, her forces striking the enemy's exposed flank with the fury of those fighting for the very existence. The foreign lines wavered, their perfect coordination faltering for the first time. Alaric seized the moment, rallying the rebels for one final push, his voice cutting through the din of battle. They crashed into the enemy's disordered ranks like a hammer blow, the tide turning with shocking suddenness as the foreign army began an organized retreat back toward the mountains. The victory was Pyrrhic, the field littered with corpses from both sides, the loyalist commander among the fallen, the rebel forces decimated. As Alaric knelt to catch his breath amidst the carnage, he noticed something strange about the dead foreigners. Their armor bore a symbol he'd seen before, in the old one's hut. A circle with 3 intersecting lines. A dead marker. The realization struck him like a physical blow. This wasn't just an invasion. It was a reckoning, and the true battle was only beginning. Chapter 65. The aftermath of the battle was a blur of pain and exhaustion, the survivors moving like ghosts through the field of the fallen, tending to wounded and gathering weapons in equal measure. The foreign army had withdrawn back into the mountains, but no one believed they were truly gone. This had been a probing attack, not the main assault. The blacksmith's daughter took command of the combined forces by default, the loyalist troops accepting her leadership with the pragmatic resignation of soldiers who recognized competence when they saw it. Alaric spent the night studying the captured enemy artifacts, their strange weapons that hummed faintly when touched, their armor that seemed too light for its strength, the peculiar symbols etched into every surface. The circle with 3 lines appeared repeatedly, sometimes accompanied by other markings that made his head ache if he stared too long. The few prisoners they'd taken remained silent, their eyes tracking every movement with unsettling intensity, their bonds checked constantly because they showed no fear of pain or death. Dawn brought grim discoveries. Scouts reported the enemy had left no wounded behind, their retreat too orderly, their losses seemingly calculated rather than suffered. Worse, some of the rebel and loyalist dead were missing, not just stripped of valuables, but gone entirely, their bodies taken for purposes no one wanted to contemplate. The blacksmith's daughter called a war council at midday, the surviving leaders from both sides gathering in a captured enemy tent that felt wrong in ways no one could articulate, the angles slightly off, the fabric too smooth, the whole structure humming with barely perceptible energy. The debate was brief and brutal: fall back to more defensible positions or press forward into the mountains to take the fight to the enemy. Alaric listened in silence, his fingers tracing the symbol on a captured shield, the old one's words echoing in his memory. When the time came to vote, he surprised everyone by speaking for the first time. "We go forward." His voice carried the weight of hard-won certainty. "This isn't just an army. It's a reckoning, and it won't stop until we make it." The vote was unanimous. They would march into the mountains, into the teeth of whatever nightmare was coming. Because some debts could only be paid in blood, and this one had been owed for a very long time. The preparations began immediately, the combined forces stripping down to essentials, the wounded sent back to the capital with warnings of what might follow. Alaric sharpened his knife with methodical strokes, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a meditation on mortality. The dreams had stopped, replaced by a single image that burned behind his eyes, a mountain pass, and something waiting beyond it. Something old, something hungry. The march would begin at dawn. Whatever was coming, they would meet it head-on. Because there was no going back now. The debt would be paid. Chapter 66. The ascent into the mountains began under a sky the color of old bruises, the air growing thinner with each step upward, the path narrowing until they were forced to march single file along knife-edge ridges. The foreign army had left signs of their passage, discarded equipment bearing that same strange symbol, patches of vegetation that had blackened and died in perfect geometric patterns, the occasional set of footprints sunk too deep into stone for any human weight. Alaric led the vanguard, his senses straining for any hint of ambush, the knife at his belt humming faintly against his thigh as if resonating with some unseen energy. The blacksmith's daughter moved up and down the column, her voice hoarse from shouting orders over the ever-present wind that howled through the peaks. The loyalist troops had integrated with the rebels more smoothly than anyone expected, the shared trauma of battle erasing old animosities in the face of this greater threat. By nightfall they reached a high pass where the enemy had clearly camped, the ground was scorched in precise circles, the rocks bearing odd striations as if something had melted and refrozen them repeatedly. Scouts reported movement farther up the trail, but whatever was up there wasn't bothering to hide. They made camp in defensive formation, no fires, cold rations, sentries posted in overlapping rings. Alaric took first watch, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the enemy, but the mountains were eerily silent, no insects, no birds, just the occasional groan of shifting rocks. The dreams returned with a vengeance when he finally slept, visions of vast machines buried beneath the mountains, of ancient wars fought with weapons that could unmake reality itself, of a debt that had been owed since long before his people had built their first mud huts. He woke with a start just before dawn, his knife already in hand, the sense of impending doom so strong he could taste it like metal on his tongue. The attack came as the first light touched the highest peaks, not from ahead, but from below. The rear guard's screams echoed up the pass as something tore through them with impossible speed. The enemy hadn't retreated. They'd been herding them toward this killing ground all along. Chapter 67. Chaos erupted as the thing hit their lines. Not a soldier, not even humanoid, but a shifting mass of black tendrils and gleaming edges that moved faster than the eye could follow. Weapons passed through it without effect. Arrows might as well have been whispers for all the damage they did. The creature, machine, whatever it was, carved through the panicking troops like a scythe through wheat, leaving behind not corpses but empty husks that collapsed into piles of grey dust. Alaric grabbed the blacksmith's daughter and hauled her behind a rock outcropping as the thing changed direction with unnatural precision, homing in on the strongest concentrations of resistance. The knife at his belt was vibrating violently now, the hum building to an almost painful intensity. Without thinking, he drew it, and the world changed. The creature's true form resolved before his eyes, no longer a blur but a clearly defined structure of interlocking geometric shapes, pulsing with sickly light. More importantly, he could see its core, a spinning nexus of energy deep within its shifting mass. The blacksmith's daughter was shouting something, but her voice sounded distant, muffled. Alaric moved without conscious thought, his body propelled by some instinct deeper than survival. The creature turned as he approached, tendrils lashing out, but the knife intercepted them with impossible precision, shearing through the black filaments like they were cobwebs. He could see the path now, the openings in its defenses that shouldn't have been there, the rhythm to its movements that hinted at some deeper programming. 3 steps, a pivot, the knife thrust forward into the exact center of that spinning nexus. The blade flared white-hot as it connected, the creature's form shuddering violently before collapsing inward on itself with a sound like shattering glass. Silence fell over the pass, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of the survivors. The knife cooled in Alaric's hand, its edge now inscribed with faint markings that hadn't been there before, the same 3-line circle, but inverted. The blacksmith's daughter stared at him with something between awe and terror. What in the hells was that? Alaric studied the knife, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. A collector, and with a debt. Chapter 68. The survivors regrouped in shocked silence, their numbers reduced by nearly a third from the brief attack. Whatever that thing had been, it hadn't fought like a soldier, it had harvested, moving with the ruthless efficiency of a farmer reaping wheat. The blacksmith's daughter organized a head count while Alaric examined the knife more closely, the new markings pulsing faintly as if in time with some unseen energy. Scouts reported the path ahead was clear, but no one believed they were safe. That thing had been waiting for them, which meant there would be more. The loyalist troops were on the verge of mutiny, the discipline shattered by an enemy their training hadn't prepared them to face. Only the grim determination of their surviving officers kept them in line, the shared terror of what lay behind them outweighing the fear of what might lie ahead. They broke camp with unnatural haste, leaving the dead where they lay. There was no time for proper burial rites, not when the next attack could come at any moment. The march upward continued, the air growing so thin that several soldiers collapsed, their lips turning blue as they gasped for breath that wouldn't come. Alaric led from the front now, the knife held openly in his hand, its presence seeming to ward off whatever other horrors might be lurking in the rocks. The pass narrowed further until they were squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for a man in armor, the walls pressing in with claustrophobic intensity. Then, without warning, the path opened onto a sight that froze them all in their tracks, a vast plateau stretching to the horizon, its surface covered in geometric structures that defied comprehension, their angles all wrong, their surfaces shifting even as they watched. At the center stood a towering spire of black crystal, pulsing with that same sickly light they'd seen in the creature's core. And arrayed before it, rank upon rank of the enemy army, standing motionless as statues. Waiting, the blacksmith's daughter moved to Alaric's side, her voice barely above a whisper. This wasn't a retreat, it was an invitation. Alaric's grip tightened on the knife. The debt would be paid today, one way or another. Chapter 69. The descent onto the plateau felt like walking into a dream, the air thick and resistant, the light bending strangely around the alien structures, their every step sending ripples across surfaces that shouldn't have been able to ripple. The enemy army remained motionless, their polished armor reflecting the pulsating light from the central spire in hypnotic patterns. Alaric's knife continued to vibrate, its hum now audible to those standing nearest him, the markings along its blade glowing faintly. The blacksmith's daughter kept the troops in tight formation, though what good that would do against whatever these things were, no one knew. They'd advanced halfway to the spire when the ground trembled beneath them, not an earthquake, but something far more precise, as if the plateau itself was responding to their presence. The enemy ranks parted smoothly, revealing a figure approaching, humanoid but subtly wrong, its movements too fluid, its proportions just slightly off. It stopped a dozen paces away and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the words bypassing their ears to form directly in their minds. The reckoning is come. The debt will be paid. Alaric stepped forward, the knife held before him like a talisman. What debt? The figure's head tilted at an impossible angle. Your kind was given the land, the mountains, the sky. The terms were clear. When the collectors came, the debt would be paid in full. The blacksmith's daughter moved to Alaric's side, her sword drawn. We don't know anything about this. The figure made a sound that might have been laughter. Ignorance does not void a contract. The markers were placed. The terms were set. Your ancestors agreed. Alaric's vision swam suddenly, the knife's markings flaring bright as. A flood of images assaulted him, ancient people standing where he now stood, signing something in blood, accepting gifts of knowledge and power in exchange for, what? The vision shifted, showing vast machines buried deep beneath the earth, dormant but not dead, waiting for some predetermined time to awaken and collect. The debt wasn't gold or goods. It was them, their lives, their very essence. The figure extended a hand that had too many fingers. The payment is due. Behind it, the enemy army stirred to life in perfect unison, their weapons humming with that same terrible energy. Alaric looked down at the knife in his hand, its purpose now clear, not just a weapon, but a key. One that could either pay the debt, or cancel it forever. The choice was his. The battle for their world was about to begin. Chapter 70. The knife's hum rose to a piercing whine as Alaric made his decision, the blade flaring with light so bright it cast no shadows. The figure recoiled as if struck, its too many fingers curling into claws. You cannot refuse the reckoning. Alaric lunged forward, the knife moving with a will of its own, its edge slicing through the figure's outstretched hand like it was mist. The creature shrieked, a sound that seemed to come from the air itself rather than its mouth, and staggered back, its form flickering between solidity and something else. Behind it, the enemy army surged forward with mechanical precision, their weapons glowing that same sickly hue. The blacksmith's daughter shouted orders, the rebel and loyalist troops forming a defensive circle despite their terror. They might not understand what was happening, but they knew death when they saw it. Alaric pressed his attack, the knife guiding his movements now, showing him openings he shouldn't have been able to see. Each strike landed with uncanny precision, the blade carving chunks from the figure's form that evaporated before they hit the ground. But for every piece he removed, two more seemed to grow back, the thing's true mass shifting somewhere beyond normal reality. The battle raged around them, the enemy troops cutting through human defenses with terrifying efficiency. Where their weapons struck, flesh didn't just die, it unraveled, dissolving into motes of light that drifted toward the central spire. The blacksmith's daughter fought like a demon, her sword shattering against an enemy shield but grabbing a fallen spear to continue the fight, her voice hoarse from shouting encouragement to her crumbling forces. Alaric realized with dawning horror that they couldn't win this way. For every enemy they felled, a dozen of their own fell, and the spire continued to pulse hungrily, drinking in the energy of the fallen. The knife's light began to flicker, its power not infinite. The figure laughed again, its form now towering over him, its voice the grinding of continental plates. You see now, the debt always comes due. Alaric's gaze darted to the spire, then back to the knife. A reckless idea formed. If this was about energy, about payment, then maybe. He fainted left, then broke away suddenly, sprinting toward the spire with every ounce of strength he had left. The figure howled in outrage, giving chase with terrifying speed, but Alaric had the advantage of desperation. The spire loomed before him, its surface humming with stolen life, its apex disappearing into the sickly clouds above. Without hesitation, he plunged the knife into its base, not to destroy it, but to offer something else. Himself. The debt would be paid, but on his terms. The world exploded in light and pain as the spire's energy rushed into him through the knife, the two opposing forces colliding in his flesh with apocalyptic force. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the figure's form unraveling, its scream of rage echoing across time itself. Then nothing. Chapter 71. Consciousness returned in fits and starts, each blink revealing a slightly clearer image of the devastation around him. The plateau was littered with bodies, human and otherwise, the alien structures now dull and lifeless, their impossible angles sagging like melted wax. The spire had shattered, its fragments scattered across the battlefield like broken glass. The knife lay beside him, its blade now dark and inert, the strange markings faded to near invisibility. Groans and whimpers rose from the survivors as they picked themselves up, their weapons broken, their armor scorched. The blacksmith's daughter was among the first to reach him, her face streaked with blood and soot, her eyes wide with something between awe and terror. "What did you do?" Alaric tried to speak, but his throat was raw, his voice gone. He managed to lift a hand toward the ruins of the spire, then let it fall. Whatever had happened, whatever bargain he'd struck, it had worked. The debt was paid. The collectors were gone. The few remaining enemy troops stood motionless, their armor dark, their weapons dead. As the survivors watched, one by one they simply dissolved, leaving behind only their empty shells. The wind howled across the plateau, carrying away the last traces of the nightmare. In the distance, the first real sunlight they'd seen in days broke through the clouds, painting the shattered battlefield in gold and crimson. The war was over, not just this battle, but all of it. The rebellion, the Lord's oppression, the ancient cycle of debt and payment. They were free, truly free. Alaric closed his eyes against the light, the weight of everything he'd done, everything they'd all done, settling over him like a shroud. The knife's final whisper echoed in his mind as sleep took him. The debt is paid, but all accounts must balance in the end. Chapter 72. The journey back from the mountains was a silent procession of the broken and the scarred, the survivors moving like ghosts through a world that no longer made sense. Alaric drifted in and out of consciousness, his body racked with fever, his skin etched with strange markings that pulsed faintly in time with his heartbeat. The blacksmith's daughter led what remained of their forces, rebel and loyalist alike, down the treacherous paths, the former enemies now bound together by the shared horror of what they'd faced. The land itself seemed changed by the battle on the plateau. Trees grew in strange spirals where before they'd stood straight, streams ran backward up slopes for short distances before resuming their normal course, and the air carried a metallic tang that lingered at the back of the throat. Word of their victory, if it could be called that, spread ahead of them, carried by scouts and refugees who spoke in hushed tones of the end of days barely averted. By the time they reached the foothills, a delegation from the capital awaited them, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. The remaining lords had gathered as well, their finery looking absurd amidst the devastation, their expressions a mix of relief and dawning realization. The old order was truly gone, swept away by something far larger than the petty squabbles. The blacksmith's daughter handled the negotiations with weary patience, her voice hoarse but firm as she laid out the terms of the new world they would build. Alaric heard none of it, his mind adrift in a sea of fractured memories and half-understood truths. The knife was gone, lost somewhere on that impossible battlefield, its purpose fulfilled. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy quiet, he slipped away into the darkness, his body moving with singular purpose toward the one place he'd avoided since the rebellion began, the river where he'd nearly died, where the Old One had pulled him back from the brink. The water was icy despite the season, its current strong, but he waded in without hesitation, the markings on his skin flaring brighter as the water reached his chest. The debt was paid, but accounts must balance, and some prices could only be paid in full. Chapter 73. The current took him quickly, the cold numbing his limbs as the river carried him toward whatever awaited downstream. His last thoughts were not of the battles fought or the lives taken, but of a simple moment years gone by, his father teaching him to mend a millstone, the sun warm on his back, the smell of fresh flour in the air. A life that seemed to belong to someone else now. Then darkness. Then something else. He awoke on a familiar shore, the scent of burning herbs thick in the air, the Old One's hut standing crooked against the pre-dawn sky. His body ached in ways that had nothing to do with wounds, the markings on his skin now faded to faint silver scars. The crone sat by the fire, stirring a pot of something that smelled like memory and regret. She didn't look up as he approached, her voice the same creaking whisper he remembered. "Told you debts come due." Alaric collapsed by the fire, his strength gone, his purpose fulfilled. The Old One studied him with eyes that saw too much, nodding slowly as if confirming some private suspicion. "Rest now, miller's son. Your war is over." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did. Chapter 74. The world moved on without him, as worlds do. The blacksmith's daughter ruled wisely from the capital, her council a mix of former rebels and pragmatic lords who understood that the old ways were gone forever. The strange disturbances in the land faded with time, though farmers still occasionally found patches of spiraling crops or rocks that hummed when touched. In a village that had once been called Eldamere, new houses rose from the ashes, their foundations strong, their doors open to any who needed shelter. The mill was rebuilt by hands that remembered its original shape, the great wheel turning once more in the clear water of the stream. And in a hut at the edge of the woods, an old woman tended her herbs and muttered to spirits only she could see, her occasional visitor a silent figure who helped with the chores and sometimes, on clear nights, could be seen staring at the stars with eyes that held too much knowing. The knife was gone, the debt was paid, and the account balanced at last. But stories, like debts, have a way of circling back when least expected. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, something ancient stirred in its sleep. Waiting, watching, remembering. The wheel turns, but the river flows ever onward. Chapter 75. The years slipped by like water through a mill race, each season blurring into the next until time itself seemed to lose meaning. Alaric's hair grew white as the mountain snows, his body slowly bending under the weight of years and memories too heavy to name. The Old One had passed in her sleep one winter night, her final words a cryptic murmur about the wheel turning full circle. He buried her beneath the twisted oak where she'd once gathered herbs, the earth accepting her remains with the same indifference it showed all things. The hut became his own, though he made few changes, just mended the thatch when it leaked and kept the fire burning against the damp that crept into his bones. Villagers came sometimes, seeking remedies or advice, their eyes darting nervously around the shadowed interior as they spoke in hushed tones of the legend who lived among them. He gave them what help he could, though his hands now shook when preparing the Old One's remedies, his knowledge imperfect but sufficient. The nightmares still came, less frequent but no less vivid, the faces of the dead watching him with expressions he could no longer decipher. On clear days, when the pain in his joints allowed, he would walk the path to Eldamere, no longer ruins but a thriving village once more, the mill wheel turning steadily under the care of a young family who had taken over its operation. They never recognized the stooped old man who sometimes paused to watch the grain being ground, his gaze distant, his fingers absently tracing the silver scars that peeked above his collar. Chapter 76. The girl appeared at first light one autumn morning, her bare feet silent on the dew-damp grass, her dark eyes taking in the hut and its surroundings with unsettling intensity. Alaric knew her at once, not her name or her origins, but her nature. She carried the same weight behind her eyes that he'd seen in the blacksmith's daughter all those years ago, the same unspoken understanding that the world was not as simple as others believed. "They say you killed a god," she said without preamble, her voice clear as spring water. Alaric snorted, stirring the embers of last night's fire. "They say a lot of things." The girl stepped closer, unafraid, her gaze locked on his face. "I dreamed of the mountain, the black spire, the debt." His hands stilled at that, the old familiar chill creeping up his spine. The markings beneath his skin throbbed faintly, a reminder of things best left forgotten. "Dreams are just dreams," he muttered, but the girl shook her head, pulling up her sleeve to reveal skin etched with faint silver lines, not scars, but something more. A pattern achingly familiar. Alaric's breath caught in his chest as understanding dawned. The wheel had turned indeed. The girl tilted her head, her expression solemn beyond her years. "They're coming back. The collectors. I need to know how you stop them." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something older, something that had no name in any human tongue. The fire crackled between them, its light dancing across faces young and old, both marked by forces beyond their understanding. Alaric let out a long, shuddering breath and reached for the kettle. "Sit down, girl. This will take a while." The lesson began. Chapter 77. The girl, Lira, she called herself, proved to be a quick study. Her hands were steady as she prepared the herbs Alaric showed her, her mind sharp enough to grasp the old remedies with only a few repetitions. But it was the markings on her skin that held his attention, the way they shimmered faintly in certain lights, reacting to phases of the moon or shifts in the wind that shouldn't have been perceptible. She spoke little of where she'd come from, only that her village had been nestled deep in the northern woods, a place where the trees grew crooked and the earth sometimes hummed. They'd cast her out when the markings appeared, fearing what they didn't understand. Alaric recognized the story, not hers, but his own, the echoes of Eldamir and the fear that had festered there long before the Lord's men came. He didn't press her for more. Some wounds were best left unprodded. By the third day, she had taken over most of the hut's chores, her movements efficient and quiet. She didn't ask again about the mountain or the spire, but he caught her studying his scars when she thought he wasn't looking, her fingers twitching as if tracing the patterns in her mind. That night, as the fire burned low, she finally broke the silence. "You didn't just stop them," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You took something from them. Something they want back." The air in the hut grew heavy, the flames guttering as if in response. Alaric said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the embers. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with the weight of memory. "And gave something in return." Chapter 78. The dreams returned with a vengeance. Not his own, Lira's. She woke screaming the next night, her skin fever hot to the touch, the markings on her arms pulsing like living things. Alaric recognized the signs at once. The collectors were stirring, their presence brushing against the edges of the world, probing for weakness. He brewed a draught of bitterroot and moonflower, forcing it past her clenched teeth until her thrashing stilled and her breathing evened. But the damage was done. The hut's walls now bore faint, scorched lines where her fingers had scraped against them, the patterns too deliberate to be accidental. A message, or a warning. At dawn, he found her sitting by the stream, her arms submerged to the elbows in the icy water. "They're not gone," she said without looking up. "Just waiting." Alaric crouched beside her, his old bones protesting the movement. "Waiting for what?" She lifted her hands from the water, droplets cascading from fingers that no longer trembled. For the debt to be called due again. The markings on her skin had darkened overnight, the silver now edged in something darker, something that shimmered like oil on water. Alaric exhaled slowly. He'd hoped, foolishly, that the reckoning had ended on that plateau. But debts, like stories, had a way of outliving those who incurred them. Chapter 79. They left the hut at first light, packs laden with what few supplies they'd need. Lira moved with purpose now, her earlier uncertainty burned away by whatever vision the dream had shown her. Alaric didn't ask for details. Some things were better faced unprepared. The villagers watched them pass in silence, their expressions caught between awe and fear. A few made warding signs as Lira walked by, their whispers trailing after her like smoke. She paid them no mind, her gaze fixed on the northern horizon where the mountains loomed, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. Alaric kept pace beside her, his walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the packed earth of the road. His scars ached with each step, a reminder of the price he'd paid, and the ones still owed. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the blackened woods where Lira's village had once stood. The trees here grew twisted, their branches knotted into shapes that hurt the eye to follow. The air hummed faintly, a sound just at the edge of hearing. Lira didn't hesitate, stepping into the shadow of the trees without a backward glance. Alaric followed, the old familiar dread settling in his chest. The collectors were coming, and this time, there would be no spire to stab, no knife to wield. Just a girl with markings she didn't understand and an old man who'd already bargained away most of what he had to give. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of ozone and something older, something hungry. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Not from an animal, not from anything natural. Lira's hand found his, her grip surprisingly strong. "Tell me the rest of the story," she said. "The part you left out before." Alaric closed his eyes. The debt would be paid, one way or another. Chapter 80. The truth came harder than he'd expected. Not because he'd forgotten, he could never forget, but because speaking it aloud made it real again. The knife hadn't just been a weapon. It had been a key, yes, but also a tether. A way to bind the debt to him alone. When he'd plunged it into the spire, he hadn't just disrupted the collector's reckoning, he'd taken a piece of it into himself. The markings on his skin weren't scars. They were sigils, a contract written in flesh and blood. Lira listened in silence, her expression unreadable. Around them, the woods grew darker, the hum in the air deepening to a vibration that set their teeth on edge. "So they're not coming for the world," she said at last. "They're coming for you." Alaric nodded, his throat tight. He'd cheated them, broken the terms, and now the bill had come due. A branch cracked closer this time. Then another. Shapes moved between the trees, their forms indistinct but getting clearer with every passing second. Lira's markings flared bright as coals, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Alaric squeezed her hand. "Run," he said. "When I tell you, you run and don't look back." She shook her head, her dark eyes reflecting the growing light of her own skin. "No." The word was quiet but final. "You taught me how to fight them. Now teach me how to win." The first collector stepped into the clearing, its too many limbs unfolding like a nightmare-given form. Alaric exhaled. The debt would be paid, but not in the way they expected. He met Lira's gaze and saw his own resolve mirrored there. Together, then, the reckoning began.